Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we travel back more than a century to a lonely farmhouse hidden deep in the Bavarian countryside. A place so isolated that even the wind seemed to pass by without stopping. A place where a family lived in silence, and where something far more unsettling lived with them. Hinterkaifeck. To outsiders, it was nothing more than a small farm. A quiet property surrounded by forest, snow, and long stretches of dirt road. But inside its walls, strange things began to happen long before the murders ever took place. Footsteps in the attic. Newspapers appearing from cities no one in the family had visited. Keys disappearing. Voices heard at night. And tracks in the snow, leading toward the house, but never leading away. 6 people would die here. A family wiped out in a single night, with an axe, yet the killer stayed in the house afterward. Ate their food. Fed their animals. Lived among the dead. For more than 100 years, this case has remained unsolved. A puzzle frozen in time, without confession, without motive, without closure. Just silence, footprints, and shadows that refuse to fade. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see this late-night true crime family gathered across the world. Now settle in, let everything else fall away, and follow me into the cold, unsettling mystery of the Hinterkaifeck Murders, a case where the truth has never found its way home. This is True Crime Records. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. There's a new calm documentary waiting for you every night. Chapter 1. The Isolated Farm at the Edge of the Woods. The story of Hinterkaifeck does not begin with violence. It begins with quiet. A quiet so deep, so absolute, that anyone who visited the farm remembered it long after they left. It was not far from the village of Grobern in Bavaria, yet it felt like a world entirely its own. A narrow dirt road wound through thick trees and open fields before reaching the homestead. A cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by farmland, meadows, and the dense forest that locals avoided after dark. In 1922, Germany was still recovering from the aftermath of the First World War. Scarcity lived in every house. Hard work was the foundation of survival. And the Gruber family had survived by working harder than most. But hard work came with a cost, and the people in the nearby village often saw the Grubers as distant, solitary, and marked by a heaviness that no one could fully name. The family consisted of 6 people at the time of the murders. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, stern, feared, and deeply controlling. His wife, Kazilia, quiet and withdrawn, aging under burdens she never spoke of. Their widowed daughter, Victoria, beautiful and musical, but trapped in a life defined by scandal. Victoria's 2 children. 7-year-old Kazilia, sensitive and bright, and 2-year-old Joseph, a toddler caught in the cross-currents of adult secrecy. And finally, the maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived on the farm that very day, unaware she would not live to see another sunrise. But long before the murders themselves, something strange began happening at Hinterkaifeck. The first signs came slowly. Little disturbances, odd details, things that could be explained, until they no longer could. Months before the deaths, the family reported hearing footsteps in the attic. Not the faint creaks of settling wood, but deliberate footsteps, as if someone walked slowly along the beams overhead. Andreas Gruber searched the attic multiple times. He found nothing. No intruder. No tools. No tracks. Only silence pressing back at him. Then Victoria noticed footprints in the snow leading from the forest toward the house, but none leading back out. The prints stopped at the threshold, disappearing under the barn door. The family searched the buildings again. Nothing. No one. Just the wind moving through the cracks in the boards. Keys went missing. Shadows flickered in the windows at night, and the family felt watched. Andreas eventually told a neighbor about the troubling noises and unexplained events. His neighbor advised him to report it to the police. Andreas refused. He had always been a proud man, perhaps too proud to admit fear. Or perhaps the secrets within the family were darker than anything outside. What unsettled the villagers most was how the family's behavior changed. Andreas became even more severe. Victoria seemed nervous, locking doors more often. Little Kazilia told classmates she had trouble sleeping, that voices whispered outside, and that her mother cried late at night. But life on the farm continued. Animals had to be fed. Fields had to be tended. Routine covered anxiety like a thin blanket. Then came the night when everything shifted. The night when a set of events began to move silently toward Hinterkaifeck, step by step. Without hesitation, a news report days later would say that the Grubers lived their final evening in quiet routine. But no one truly knows what the atmosphere in that house felt like. Whether they sensed something approaching, whether the noises in the attic returned, whether the shadows outside the windows had grown darker. What is known is this. In the early hours of the night, the killer or killers entered the property. Not by force, not with chaos, but with patience. And familiarity. It was the beginning of one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in criminal history, and the final hours of a family who had already been living with fear long before death arrived. The days leading up to the murders passed quietly on the Hinterkaifeck farm, but a strange tension settled over the property like a thin layer of frost. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, just small details that felt out of place, though no one truly understood their meaning at the time. The family tried to continue their routines. They fed the livestock before sunrise. They chopped wood for the long, cold evenings. They cooked simple meals in the small kitchen where the stove never fully warmed the air. But beneath these familiar movements, an unease lingered. It was the feeling of being watched, not from a window or doorway, from everywhere and nowhere at once. Victoria noticed it first. She had always been the most intuitive in the family, the one who heard things the others dismissed. She claimed the attic had begun creaking late at night, soft steps that paused whenever she held her breath to listen more closely. She said she felt colder drafts than normal, moving through the house even when the doors were sealed. Her father told her it was nonsense. The wind, the wood settling, a tired mind making patterns out of darkness, but she didn't argue. She had learned long ago that the others only worried more when she spoke too plainly. So she stayed quiet, and the silence allowed the unease to spread. Little Kazilia noticed it too, though she never explained what she felt. Children rarely do. She simply stayed close to her mother more often. She hesitated before stepping into certain rooms. Sometimes she paused in the doorway of the barn, peering into the dimness as if waiting for her eyes to adjust before trusting her own footsteps. Andreas Gruber tried to pretend he felt nothing. He moved through the property with the same stern efficiency he always had. He fed the animals. He checked the fences. He repaired small things that didn't truly need repairing. But even he found himself glancing behind him more often, listening longer than necessary before climbing into bed. The family patriarch, stubborn as he was, could not shake a quiet suspicion that the strange footprints in the snow had been more than an accident. Someone had crossed onto their land in deliberate silence, leaving no trace of having left at night. The house changed its character. The walls seemed to breathe a little. The floorboards whispered under unseen weight. The lamps flickered in drafts that had no source. The family would gather near the stove, speaking softly about their day, avoiding the growing question that hung between them. A question none of them wanted to ask aloud. Was someone inside the house with them? The animals sensed something too. The cows became restless, shifting heavily in their stalls long after dark. The dog barked at corners of the yard where nothing moved. The horses paced anxiously whenever the moonlight cut through the gaps in the barn walls. Animals often react before humans understand what's happening, and their unease only deepened the atmosphere around the farm. Despite this, the family did not contact the police. In those days, rural life meant handling problems yourself. Outsiders were rarely trusted, authorities even less so. And the Gruber family had its own complicated history with the community. People respected them for their hard work, but they also whispered about them behind closed doors. Rumors had followed this family for years, creating a distance no one dared cross directly. All of this left the Grubers isolated when they needed support the most. On the fourth night after the maid fled her job, another strange sound echoed through the house. A soft thump from the attic. Not loud, not violent, just a subtle shift in weight. Victoria woke instantly. She sat up in bed, listening, her heart steady but alert. There it was again. A creak, then stillness. She considered waking her father, but she knew what he would say. That she was imagining things. That the house had always made noise. That nothing was wrong, and she should go back to sleep. So she remained still, listening, breathing quietly, waiting for the sound to repeat. It didn't. But the absence of noise felt worse than the noise itself. Morning came cold and gray. The family moved through their routines with the same caution they had carried all week. Andreas checked the barn again, but found nothing unusual. Victoria carried water from the well and tried not to glance at the attic window. The children played in the yard, unaware of the growing tension in the adults' faces by midday. The unease had become heavy enough that even Andreas slowed his pace. He paused by the edge of the field and surveyed the tree line. The silence of the forest pressed in around him. No birds, no wind, no movement. The world felt too still that he walked back toward the house without finishing his work. He didn't know why he stopped. He couldn't explain the sensation. It felt like instinct. Like something in him understood a truth he refused to speak. The family gathered for dinner that evening in a quiet that did not feel natural. No one talked about the noises. No one mentioned the footprints. No one brought up the missing keys or the newspaper that had appeared in the house without anyone buying it. They ate. They cleaned. They prepared for bed. They followed the familiar steps of their nightly routine, knowing something had shifted but not knowing how to stop it. That night, the attic remained silent, not because nothing was happening, but because the person hiding there no longer needed to move. They had already learned everything they needed to know. The family did not realize it yet, but the final hours of their lives had already begun. The last weeks on the Hinterkaifeck farm drifted forward with a strange heaviness no one could fully explain. Life looked ordinary from a distance. Fields were tended. Animals fed. The family moved through their routines the same way they always had. But inside the farmhouse, something unseen pressed gently against the edges of their days, as if waiting. Neighbors who passed by noticed small things that did not feel right. A window that had been opened suddenly closed. A lantern glowing in the barn at an hour when the family was usually asleep. Footprints in the frost leading toward the house, with none leading away. Each detail felt harmless alone, but together, they created a quiet sense of unease that no one could place into words. Andreas Gruber, the head of the household, was not a man easily frightened. He worked the land with the stubbornness of someone who had survived hardship after hardship. Yet even he could not ignore how the farm felt different. He mentioned the sounds in the attic more than once. Footsteps that did not belong to anyone in the family. Soft movements that came after the lamps were extinguished. He searched the upper rooms with a lantern, finding nothing except dust and stored tools. Still, the feeling lingered. As if the darkness was holding its breath, his wife, Kazilia, kept her concerns quieter. She watched her husband check locks twice at night. She watched him pause before opening the barn each morning. She knew he felt something he could not explain, and she knew he did not want to frighten their children. But fear has a way of leaking through even the strongest attempts at calm. Their granddaughter, young and perceptive, asked once why her grandfather kept listening toward the attic door. He only smiled and said he thought the wind was playing tricks. Life continued anyway, because life often has no choice. The family prepared meals. They went into town for supplies. They tended to their animals and their land because work was the only constant they could trust. But beneath the rhythm of everyday tasks, a subtle tension stretched itself over the farmhouse like a thin film. It did not disrupt their days. It simply changed the way those days felt. Neighbors later said the farm seemed isolated in a way they had never noticed before. The trees felt too still around it. The yard seemed too quiet. Even the smoke rising from the chimney looked strangely slow, as though the air itself resisted movement. These observations came only after everything had happened, when people searched for signs they might have missed. But memory often sharpens details only in hindsight. Inside the farmhouse, Victoria Gabriel carried her own worries. She had confided to a friend days earlier that she felt watched. She could not explain why. She only knew she sometimes sensed eyes on her when no one was around. She had brushed it off, blaming the long shadows of early spring. Yet the feeling did not leave her. The youngest child sensed something too, though children rarely describe fear the way adults do. She told classmates she had heard voices at night. Not conversations, not whispers, just the faint sense that someone else was inside the walls. None of the other children took it seriously. Children say odd things all the time. But teachers remembered those words later. They remembered the tone she used. Quiet. Matter dash of dash fact. As the days slipped closer to the night that would change everything, the small signs grew a little more pronounced. A newspaper appeared on the doorstep, one the family never subscribed to. Keys vanished, then reappeared. Footsteps were found in fresh snow leading up to the barn. The family spoke of these things only quietly, as if naming their unease might give it strength. There was no feeling of impending violence, only a sense of being observed, a presence that did not reveal itself, a stillness that did not behave like ordinary silence. It was as if the farm had become a stage prepared for something unseen. With the family moving through their routines unaware they were not entirely alone, on the final evening before their disappearance, the house glowed with soft lamplight. Dinner was prepared. Animals were secured for the night. Tools were put away. Nothing seemed out of place except the thick quiet that settled over the property like a blanket. No wind. No passing travelers. Only the faint creak of old wood under shifting temperature. A familiar sound that, in any other week, would have meant nothing. Later, some would speculate that the intruder was already inside the house by then, moving carefully through the attic or the narrow crawl spaces that connected the upper rooms. Others believed he watched from outside, patient and practiced. No one knows for certain, but what is known is that the family sensed something in those last hours. Not danger, not a threat, just awareness. A feeling like a shadow that does not match the shape of anything else in the room. When the lamps were extinguished, the farmhouse returned to darkness. The family slept in their rooms. The animals settled. The house breathed in the slow, careful rhythm of a place trying to rest. But somewhere, in a space between the living and the unseen, someone else waited. Unmoving. Listening. Preparing. It was the last night the family would ever know. And yet nothing marked it as unusual. No cry. No warning. Only the soft quiet that had hovered over the property for weeks. A quiet that now felt like a curtain slowly beginning to fall. The tragedy that would shock the nation had not yet begun. But its presence was already there. Silent. Patient. Close. Chapter 2. Discovery and First Questions. The morning the police finally arrived, the village did not know how to look at the farm any longer. Hinterkaifeck had been a quiet place for generations. A house set back from a lane, a garden, an orchard where apples fell and lay untouched through the seasons. It was a place people passed without thinking. That morning, the routine of ordinary rural life fractured. The discovery changed the map of the countryside. Where children once played, where neighbors once borrowed sugar and exchanged gossip, an absence became the loudest thing anyone could hear. When the first policeman crossed the threshold, he walked into a world that seemed to have held its breath. The house was not in flames. There was no obvious sign of forced entry, no ransacked drawers, no hurried packing. Things sat where they had been left. Simple furniture, a kettle on the stove, a child's boot beside a chair. The small details accumulated into a portrait of normal life interrupted, not a scene of frantic escape. And yet the scale of the violence became impossible to ignore. The bodies, the blood, the way rooms held the traces of hands that had tried and failed to push back against something sudden and lethal. These were facts that rendered speculation inadequate. In the days that followed, Hinterkaifeck became a locus of questions that had no immediate answers. The police walked the lane and interviewed the neighbors, as investigators always do in places where everyone knows everyone. They asked about strangers, who had been seen late at night, who had quarreled, who had inherited money. But the community itself harbored a different set of impressions. Odd sounds at night, someone feeding the animals when the household was supposed to be alone, a gate found open in the morning. Little things that felt like clues only when stacked together. People remembered details they had dismissed before. A shadow on the orchard path, a footprint by the pigsty, the smell of smoke at dawn. Memory in such moments becomes a fragile storehouse, and villagers sifted through it as if trying to assemble a photograph from scattered pieces. The investigation began with the simplest hypothesis. The crime was local and personal. Motive, investigators thought, must lie in disputes, jealousy, debts, family quarrels. Yet none of the usual markers presented themselves cleanly. The Gruber family, the core of the property's life, had no overt enemies. Their land was small, their lives modest. The idea of a robbery escalated and then dissolved. Valuables left untouched contradicted the theory that the motive had been material gain. Instead, the scene suggested something targeted, intimate, and brutal in a way that cooled the theories of a crime of opportunity. Rumors spread and multiplied because people needed patterns to hold in the face of randomness. Some whispered about vendettas reaching back generations, about inheritance disputes that had been simmering out of sight. Others leaned toward the idea of an itinerant killer, a figure moving through the countryside, who chose Hinterkaifeck as a place to stop. The more people talked, the more the story diverged into versions. With every telling, the event acquired a different edge, not because facts changed, but because human minds prefer narrative shape to an unresolved void. For the investigators, tangible leads were scarce. The technical tools of the day were blunt compared with later forensic advances. There were no DNA databases, no mobile phone records, no rapid cross-jurisdictional sharing of information. Instead, the work relied on witness interviews, careful mapping of the scene, and slowly piecing together movements around the farm in the days before the crime. They built timelines from memory. Who saw what on which evening? Who heard a scream that could or could not be attributed to the events that followed? In such reconstructions, certainty is always fragile. Time distorts detail. Sleep and drink obscured perception. Fear reshaped memory. Still, the investigators worked methodically, aware that the first week of a case often determines whether a mystery will ever be solved. The community's relationship to the place also complicated the inquiry. Hinterkaifeck was not an anonymous crime scene. It was a locus of social ties. Every neighbor was a potential witness and a participant in the same daily web of exchange. People who might have been helpful with information were sometimes reluctant to speak publicly for fear of rekindling scrutiny. In small towns, saying too much can change one's life as much as saying too little. The investigators had to navigate this social terrain with the same care they used when examining blood spatter. Gently, patiently, aware that forcing answers could push the truth further underground. As the case entered its second week, newspapers began to arrive from cities further afield. Reporters wrote urgent headlines about a grisly, almost mythic crime in a rural part of Germany. The story acquired an outside pressure it had not previously borne. This attention altered the texture of the local investigation. What had been handled quietly by county officials now rippled with public interest. That expansion had consequences. Eager theories from larger jurisdictions began to circulate. Amateur sleuths searched orchards with lanterns. Strangers came asking questions that opened fresh wounds for those still in shock. In that sense, the crime did not only mark the four walls of a farmhouse. It bent the attention of a wider public toward a place that had previously held a comfortable anonymity. Outside interest also brought resources, different kinds of expertise, additional investigators, and the benefit of broader oversight. But it brought other problems as well. Contests over jurisdiction, conflicting reports, and public demands for rapid answers pressured the slow, patient nature of investigation. When a community wants certainty quickly, investigators must choose between speed and thoroughness. This choice is never neutral. Rushed conclusions produce obvious mistakes. Hasty arrests wound lives. Yet endless delays amplify suspicion and hurt too. Hinterkaifeck's case began to taste of this bitter dilemma, the need for truth clashing with the limits of both time and the era's investigative science. Through it all, the farm remained singularly mute except for the echoes of its own absence. Doors were closed. The animals were fed. The orchard continued to drop fruit that no one harvested. Life in the village resumed in small measures, but the shadow of what had happened at Hinterkaifeck lay over ordinary chores like a persistent weather. People moved with caution and curiosity at once. They told stories around kitchen tables of what had once been a simple place, now forever altered by violence and by the questions that multiplied in its wake. In the end, the scene left everyone with the same stubborn problem. How do you name the kind of evil that leaves no clear motive, no public enemy, but which cuts through everyday life with such absolute finality? Before the murders transformed Hinterkaifeck into one of Germany's darkest mysteries, the farm itself carried an atmosphere that many villagers described as unsettling. Not violent, not threatening, just strangely isolated, as if the land held its breath between seasons. The Gruber family lived far beyond the edge of town, along a narrow dirt path that seemed to absorb sound rather than carry it. Their farm buildings were sturdy, stone walls, thick wooden beams, a long barn that curved around the courtyard. But age had darkened everything. Even in daylight, the farm looked dim, as though shadows lingered longer there than anywhere else. Neighbors rarely visited. mostly because the Grubers kept to themselves. Andreas, the patriarch, was strict, private, and difficult to approach. He worked with an intensity that exhausted everyone around him. His daughter, Victoria, carried the same quiet strength but softened it with a gentle manner that made her well-liked. Her two children, Kazilia and Joseph, brought what little light existed in the household, their laughter breaking the monotony of farm life. But even so, something about the property made strangers uneasy. At night, the wind moved through the rafters in long, hollow tones. Animals reacted to sounds that no one else could hear. Dogs growled at empty corners. The forest bordering the farm seemed to watch rather than simply stand. And then the reports began. It started with small events that villagers dismissed at first: missing tools, footprints leading into the woods, whispers of movement seen at the edge of the property. Nothing dangerous, nothing dramatic, just moments that felt slightly out of place. But over time those moments sharpened. A newspaper was found on the porch that no one in the house had ordered. Keys vanished. Footprints appeared in freshly fallen snow, leading toward the house, but not away from it. A strange creaking echoed in the attic on nights when the wind was still. Victoria confessed to a neighbor that she heard footsteps above her room, slow and deliberate, as if someone was trying not to be heard. She and her daughter sometimes heard muffled coughs in the early morning, sounds that came from the barn when no one should have been inside. Andreas dismissed all of this. He said the noises came from settling wood, or birds nesting in the rafters. He said footprints were made by workers passing through. He said missing keys were simply misplaced. But even he could not ignore everything. Weeks before the murders, he discovered a strange set of tracks leading straight toward the farmhouse from the forest. Fresh, deep, clear. And then, another visitor, a report that tools in the shed had been disturbed, though no one had been near the building. None of it made sense. None of it felt dangerous enough to report. And so the family lived with these moments as though they were just part of the landscape. Life continued. The children went to school. The cows were milked. The routine remained steady, even while unease quietly gathered in the corners of every room. The day before the murders, Andreas told a neighbor something he had never admitted before: that he felt watched. He described hearing footsteps crossing the attic again, slow, rhythmic, as if someone were pacing. When he investigated, the attic was empty. Every window was closed. Every corner was still. Yet the sound had been unmistakable. He also found a broken lock on the tool shed, though nothing appeared missing. The barn door stood open one morning without explanation, and a set of fresh footprints circled the house before disappearing into the woods. Despite all this, the family did not leave. They slept in their rooms that night. They ate breakfast in the kitchen the next morning. They prepared for another day of early spring chores as if nothing had changed. But something had, because by the time the sun rose again, the killer was already waiting somewhere on the property, quiet, patient, familiar with every sound the household made, and the sense of being watched. The one Andreas had tried to ignore was no longer a fear. It was a presence. In the final days before the murders, something strange settled over the Hinterkaifeck farm. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't anything that a visitor might have noticed at first glance. But for the people living inside that quiet rectangle of fields and forest, it felt as if the world had moved slightly out of rhythm. Andreas Gruber, the aging patriarch, woke earlier than usual each morning. He walked the perimeter of the property, looking for answers he couldn't name. The snow had melted, but the ground remained soft, holding footprints longer than it should. He scanned the forest line as though expecting to see someone standing there. He never did, yet the feeling stayed with him. Someone was near. Inside the house, Victoria tended to chores with a heaviness she tried to hide from her children. She felt eyes on her when she walked through the courtyard. The barn door creaked in ways it never had before. Even simple tasks, collecting eggs, carrying wood, preparing meals, were disturbed by a tension she could not dispel. Living on an isolated farm was not unusual for her, but this sensation was new. It felt like they were being watched from somewhere just outside the edge of sight. The children sensed the shift too. Kazilia lingered close to her mother more often, asking fewer questions than usual, speaking in soft tones. Her younger brother, little Joseph, cried at odd hours, waking from sleep as though startled by something only he could see. These moments passed quickly. but they added to the uneasy atmosphere filling the home. Neighbors noticed a change as well. When they passed the Gruber farm on their way into town, something about the place looked different. Not visibly. Nothing was broken, nothing was out of place, but the feeling was difficult to shake. The farm had always been quiet. Now it felt hollow, as though sound didn't travel the same way across the yard. Inside the barn, tools that Andreas kept in exact order were slightly displaced. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just moved. He corrected them each day, only to find them rearranged again the next morning. He said nothing to the family, unsure whether he was imagining things or uncovering a truth he didn't want to believe. The farmhouse itself, old and sturdy, developed its own voice during this time. Floors creaked in empty rooms. The attic carried whispers of movement at night. Even the stove cracked oddly when no one was near it. Living in an old home meant accepting strange sounds from time to time, but these sounds felt deliberate, as if someone were breathing in spaces meant to be emptied. Why now? The unseen presence had become part of the family's routine. It followed them silently from task to task. It threaded itself into everyday life, settling deeper as the days slipped forward. No one could name what was wrong. No one knew how to stop it. They just felt the weight of something approaching, step by slow step, without making itself known. The Grubers did not know that their story had already begun sliding toward its final chapter. They only knew that something had entered their world, something patient, something quiet, something entirely out of place in their familiar, rural life. Soon, this presence would reveal itself, and when it did, the mystery of Hinterkaifeck would begin its century-long shadow. Chapter 3: Footsteps in the Snow. The winter of 1922 settled heavily over Bavaria, pressing silence onto the countryside in a way that made even the forests seem to hold their breath. Hinterkaifeck, the lonely farmstead standing at the edge of the woods, looked like a place removed from the world, a place where time moved slower, where the days blended into one another, and where secrets could settle deep into the soil without disturbance to strangers passing through the region. The farm appeared ordinary. A modest home, a stable, a shed, a small barn whose roof disappeared under layers of hardened snow. Smoke rose from the chimney each morning, faint and disciplined, like a ritual. Livestock could be heard moving restlessly behind the wooden walls. And in the quietest hours, the wind carried the faint, rhythmic creaking of the old house's beams, sounds that could be mistaken for movement. Inside, the Gruber family continued their routines, a fragile sense of normality draped over a household already marked by tension and circumstance. Andreas Gruber, stern and aging, oversaw the farm with sharp eyes that seemed to catch everything. His wife, Kazilia, moved quietly through rooms as though conserving her strength. Their daughter, Victoria, carried a life shaped by hardship and whispers. Her children, young and impressionable, found comfort in routines, morning chores, lessons, the rare moments of warmth around the kitchen table to outsiders. Nothing appeared out of place. But beneath the roof of Hinterkaifeck, something had begun to shift. Andreas had been troubled for days. Not by the weather, not by the crops, but by things he could not fully explain. Footprints, single, deliberate, unmistakable, had appeared in the snow leading from the forest to the house. But no prints led back to the trees, as though someone had walked into their world and stayed. The door to the tool shed had been found unlocked, though Andreas remembered fastening it. A newspaper appeared on the kitchen table, one that no family member had bought, and that no neighbor had delivered. Keys vanished from hooks where they had always hung. Strange noises drifted from the attic at night, faint enough to question, loud enough to disturb sleep. When Andreas told neighbors about these things, his voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed unease. He was not a man prone to imagination. The land had shaped him into someone practical, predictable, unshakable, which made his discomfort all the more unsettling for those who heard his concerns. Some neighbors dismissed it. Winter caused wood to shift, metal to groan. Newspapers blew across fields in strange ways. Children misplaced things, but others felt a coldness settle into their thoughts. Hinterkaifeck was isolated, too isolated. If someone wished to hide there, unnoticed, it would not be difficult. If someone wished to watch the family, they would have no trouble doing so. As days passed, small disturbances accumulated. A lantern left burning in the barn, though no one recalled lighting it. Footsteps on the frozen ground where no worker had walked. The dog barking at empty corners of the yard. Sounds in the loft that Victoria tried to dismiss as settling timbers, until even she started listening more carefully at night. The family did not yet understand that these were warnings. They interpreted them as annoyances, mysteries, perhaps inconveniences brought on by fatigue or imagination. No one wants to believe their home has been breached, not by a stranger, not by a presence, not by something they cannot see. So the Grubers moved through their routines, carrying unease like a shadow. They swept the floors, fed the livestock, prepared meals, tended fires, and whispered to one another with guarded tones. None of them truly believed they were alone anymore. But none wanted to be the first to speak the fear aloud. That is the silent truth of isolation. Danger whispers long before it speaks. And sometimes people only hear the whisper on the night before everything changed. The house seemed unusually still. The wind carried no snow. The fields lay flat beneath moonlight. Even the animals, normally restless in the winter cold, seemed subdued. It was a night that asked for stillness, one where nature paused, as though waiting for the next turn of the story. Inside the farmhouse, each member of the family settled into their own quiet, unaware that the footsteps in the snow had been more than a warning. Someone had crossed into their home. Someone familiar with shadows, with silence, with waiting. And in the darkness above their heads, in the attic they feared but tried to ignore, a presence remained perfectly still, listening to a house breathe its final ordinary night. The tragedy of Hinterkaifeck had not yet arrived, but it had already begun. The following day, March 31st, moved across Hinterkaifeck with a strange stillness. The farm seemed to breathe differently, as though the air itself sensed that something unseen had stepped into the household's rhythm. Inside the main rooms, chores unfolded as they always had. The low clatter of pans, the shuffle of boots, the quiet discipline of work on a remote German farm. Yet beneath those ordinary sounds lived a subtle unease, the kind that settles before anyone can explain why they feel it. Victoria tended to her daughter, Maria, and kept a close eye on young Kazilia, who seemed unsettled since the night before. The child had spoken little at breakfast, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling, then toward the barn, as if the quiet around her carried a shape only she could sense. Children often feel shifts long before adults allow themselves to believe in them. The adults felt tension, but the girl felt presence. Andreas moved through the property with a silent determination. He inspected tools. He checked fences. He paced the yard as if searching for something he could not name. Family members watched him moving without speaking, sensing the weight behind each step. Something had shaken him deeply, but he was not the kind of man to speak fear aloud. The farm depended on stoicism, routine, and the belief that life could be controlled if one simply worked hard enough. But inside him, uncertainty had begun to grow. The footprints that appeared from the woods still bothered him. He had checked them again in daylight, hoping to find an explanation that would ease his mind. Instead, the fresh sunlight revealed what he wished it hadn't. The prints came toward the farmhouse, and none led away. It was a detail that refused to fade. He kept that observation to himself. Throughout the morning, minor noises continued to echo where they shouldn't have. A faint step in the attic, a soft thud beyond the barn door, a shifting weight that carried no clear source. They were quiet interruptions, too subtle to call alarming, yet impossible to fully ignore. Still, every household has noises that can be explained away: wood expanding, wind moving between walls, animals adjusting their positions. It was easy to dismiss these interruptions as natural, especially when the alternative felt far less comforting. In the afternoon, Victoria walked into the barn to gather hay. She paused briefly inside the doorway, sensing the space before entering fully. The barn was colder than usual. She listened carefully for movement, but heard only her own breath and the low rustling of hay against the floor. To anyone watching, she would have appeared calm, going about her responsibilities. Yet beneath that calmness lived a tightening awareness. Something in the quiet seemed deliberate, as if the silence itself was waiting. Maria, the new maid, tried to make herself useful inside the house. It was her first day on the farm, and she felt the pressure of wanting to prove she belonged. She cleaned in long, careful strokes, and listened intently to the rhythm of the household. But every now and then, her gaze would drift toward the hallway, the one that seemed darker than the others. She wasn't sure why it unsettled her. She had worked in many homes before, large, creaking houses that carried stories in their walls. But Hinterkaifeck felt different. There was an absence she couldn't explain, an emptiness that seemed to echo. Still, she told herself it was simply the nerves of a new job. Evening drifted across the sky with slow, heavy clouds. Lamps were lit early, their warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. The farm appeared peaceful from the outside, a single cluster of buildings against an open landscape, framed by quiet fields. But inside, something had shifted. The family moved with the same discipline they always had. Yet there was a subtle change in the way they closed doors, in the way they glanced toward windows, in the way silence seemed to linger after each spoken word. Night arrived without ceremony. Shadows stretched quietly through the hallways, settling into corners with an ease that felt too familiar. The family retreated into their routines, unaware that these ordinary motions were the final threads holding normalcy together. The world outside the walls had already begun to narrow. The unseen presence that had crossed into their lives, whether a stranger, a watcher, or someone far more calculated, had not left. It settled deeper into the quiet, and the house absorbed the weight of what none of them yet understood. As investigators continued sifting through what remained of the Gruber family's life, they found themselves trapped not by evidence, but by implications. Each new detail they uncovered seemed to lead back into the same circular maze of secrets the family had lived with for years. There were no clean answers, only shadows that looked like possibilities. Even the villagers who had known the Grubers for decades struggled to separate what they had truly witnessed from what they had only heard in passing. Their memories overlapped, contradicted one another, or quietly dissolved when pressed for specifics. It was as if the entire community held pieces of a puzzle that none of them fully understood or wanted to understand. The investigators realized quickly that Hinterkaifeck was not just a place where a crime had occurred. It was a place defined by silence long before the murders ever happened. People kept to themselves. Problems stayed inside homes. And reputations, once damaged, rarely healed. The Gruber family had lived within that culture of silence for years, carrying burdens that neighbors sensed but never confronted directly. Still, small fragments of truth emerged. Arguments overheard in the fields, visits from strangers, rumors of inheritance disputes, financial struggles that did not match the outward appearance of stability, a daughter who seemed increasingly withdrawn, a grandfather whose moods darkened in unpredictable ways. None of these fragments formed a clear motive, but all of them suggested that something inside the family had been under strain for far longer than anyone admitted. The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized that the violence on the farm did not appear suddenly. It grew from something older, something that had been building in the background, quietly and steadily, until the night the murders finally exposed what had been hidden for so long. Yet even as suspicion grew around the family's internal tensions, there remained a troubling detail. Whoever killed them had stayed in the house afterward, moving through the rooms, eating their food, tending to their animals, walking the same floors as the dead. This was not the behavior of someone acting out of sudden rage. It suggested patience, familiarity, and a disturbing level of comfort. AS investigators reviewed who in the family's orbit could have possessed that kind of familiarity. The list grew longer, not shorter. Friends, workers, relatives, neighbors. Anyone who had spent time on the property could have navigated the darkened rooms without hesitation. And yet, none of those known to the family seemed to fit the profile of someone who would commit such a methodical act of violence and then linger in the aftermath. The contrast between the brutality of the crime and the calculated calm of the hours that followed unsettled everyone who tried to understand it. The house itself seemed to resist clarity. Every room held clues that pointed in too many directions at once. Every detail could be interpreted in more than one way. Investigators began to feel that the truth might not simply be hidden. It might be woven into the fabric of the family's secrets so deeply that removing one thread risked unraveling them all. Still, the case could not stall. Too many questions had already begun to spread among the villagers. Too many people whispered theories late into the night. Too many fears were awakening in the quiet spaces of Hinterkaifeck. Investigators pushed forward, knowing that whatever answer they uncovered would likely not bring comfort. The truth behind the murders, whatever shape it took, was tied to something far darker than simple opportunity or chance. It was tied to the quiet cracks beneath the Gruber family's life, cracks no one had acknowledged until it was far too late. What they could not know yet was that every step deeper into the family story would only bring them closer to a truth that refused to sit neatly inside any one theory. Hinterkaifeck was not a crime scene that revealed itself through logic. It was a story that revealed itself only through shadows, and the shadows were just beginning to take shape. Chapter 4. The Footsteps in the Snow. The days after the discovery of the Hinterkaifeck murders revealed something deeply unsettling, something that made investigators pause before stepping forward. In the soft snow that covered the farmyard, a single trail of footprints led toward the house. They were clear. They were deliberate. They approached with calm purpose. But no footprints led away. It was as if whoever entered the farmhouse never left it. The investigators who first noticed this detail felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the Bavarian winter. They examined the snow again, searching for any sign of departure, a second trail, a disruption, a half-step hidden by wind. But the yard remained untouched. Every direction remained undisturbed except for the line of careful prints leading straight to the door. Inside the house, the stove was warm. The beds had been slept in after the murders. Livestock had been fed. Food had been taken from the kitchen. Someone had remained on the property for hours, perhaps even days. That someone had walked in through the snow and stayed. The investigators tried to understand what kind of person commits a crime of such brutality and then lingers in the empty silence of the victim's home. They asked each other softly, as if afraid the walls might answer. Did the killer stay to hide? Did he stay to watch? Did he stay because the darkness felt familiar to him? On the second day, a neighbor came forward with another strange detail. He said that on the night after the murders, he noticed smoke rising from the chimney. He assumed the family was inside, tending the stove as usual. Only later did he realize the horror of what that smoke truly meant. Someone was keeping warm in a house full of the dead. This detail changed everything. It shifted the investigation from a search for a fleeing killer to the search for someone comfortable enough, confident enough, to remain in place, caring for the farm animals, tending the hearth, and sleeping under the same roof where 6 lives had been taken. The investigators walked through the house again, this time more slowly. Every room felt heavier. Every corner seemed to hold breath rather than emptiness. They scanned the floors for footprints, wiped surfaces for fingerprints, and listened for sounds that might reveal a secret path or hidden space. What unsettled them most was the stillness. It was the stillness one feels not in an abandoned place, but in a place that has been recently lived in. They stepped into the barn, where 4 of the victims had been found. The hay was disturbed beyond what the struggle alone seemed to explain. It looked as though someone had sat there, perhaps rested there, perhaps watched the farmhouse from the shadows. As they examined the stalls, they realized the animals had been cared for with attention. Water buckets were full. Feed had been distributed evenly. There was no panic in the livestock, no signs that they had been left unattended long enough to become distressed. Whoever stayed at Hinterkaifeck did not behave like someone fleeing a crime. They behaved like someone taking over a space they already understood. This possibility chilled investigators in a way the cold wind never could. It suggested the killer may not have been a stranger. It hinted at familiarity, at routine, at return. Was this someone who had visited the farm before? Was this someone the family had known? The snow outside continued to hold its silent truth, a single path inward, nothing outward. The investigators kept returning to that image, that impossibility. It became the first true symbol of the Hinterkaifeck mystery, the killer's quiet arrival, and his even quieter decision to remain. The house no longer felt like a crime scene. It felt like a presence. And the more investigators walked through it, the more they began to sense that the murderer had not simply entered the farm, that he had settled into it. He had lingered, that he had lived. The investigators moved deeper into the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse, each step stirring the cold air that still clung to every surface. The longer they remained inside, the stronger the sense became that whoever had taken the lives of this family had also lingered here, quietly, deliberately, without fear of interruption. It was not only the brutality of the crime that unsettled them. It was the unmistakable impression of presence. One officer opened a door leading to the small pantry. The room smelled faintly of smoked meat, stale bread, and something metallic beneath it, an odor that had been growing stronger as the hours passed. On the wooden counter sat a loaf that had been recently sliced. The knife beside it rested at an angle that felt too casual to belong to the victims. Someone had cut themselves a meal after the murders, then set the blade down without care. It was an ordinary action carried out in a deeply abnormal moment, and that contrast intimidated the investigators more than any violence they had already seen. Another officer crouched beside the wood-burning stove. Beneath the grate, the ashes were still warm. Something had been burned late into the night. Papers, perhaps, or something small enough to fit through the narrow opening. When he stirred the ashes gently with a poker, no identifiable fragments emerged. Whatever had been destroyed was now beyond retrieval. The killer had not acted impulsively. He had taken the time to erase something deliberately, methodically. In the children's room, the blankets were disturbed as if touched recently. The rocking cradle had shifted slightly from its usual place. Investigators noticed that the window had been wiped in one small area, as though someone had pressed their forehead or hand against it to look out into the yard. This detail troubled them deeply. It meant the killer might have been watching for anyone approaching the property, and that he had expected someone might come. And still, he stayed at a set of footprints near the barn door seemed newer than the others. They led toward the main house, not away from it. One officer traced the prints slowly, noting the depth, the spacing, the direction. These steps were not hurried. They suggested someone moving with calm confidence, returning to the place where the crime had already occurred. It meant that after the murders, the killer walked freely between the barn and house, while the bodies lay undiscovered only meters away. The kitchen clock had stopped, its pendulum frozen at an hour just before dawn. The investigators could not agree whether the clock had been damaged during the struggle or stopped for another reason entirely. But its stillness added to the sensation that time inside Hinterkaifeck had fractured on the night of the murders, broken, suspended, refusing to move forward. On a small table near the entryway, they found a lamp with oil still warm inside. Someone had handled it recently. Perhaps the killer needed light during the night. Perhaps he had walked the halls holding this very lamp, examining the home that only hours earlier belonged to a living family. The officers exchanged glances, quiet, unsettled looks they did not voice. None wanted to put their fears into words, that they might not be alone in the house, that the killer, whoever he was, had not simply passed through but had occupied the space, perhaps only slipping away when he heard the investigators' wagon approaching. The attic ladder drew their attention next. The older officer who had been uneasy since their arrival pointed toward it with a tremor he tried to disguise. The underside of the hatch showed faint smudges, as if touched by hands that had recently climbed up or down. Dust on the first two rungs had been disturbed. A few strands of straw clung to the wood, straw that did not match the kind used in the barn below, suggesting it had come from clothing, not the property. When they finally opened the hatch, cold air drifted down. The attic was dark, silent, heavy with old lumber and forgotten tools. One investigator stepped inside cautiously, sweeping his lantern across the beams. There, near the far wall, lay a small indentation in the hay lining the boards, just large enough for a person to rest. Beside it lay a discarded heel of bread and a small tin cup. Someone had slept up here. Someone had lived above the family. Someone had listened to them move through the house, unaware that a stranger existed just above their ceiling. This discovery tightened the air in the room. It changed everything. The crime was no longer a sudden act of violence. It was a process, a period of watching, a period of waiting. A person who learned the family's routines, their patterns, their vulnerabilities, and then chose the moment to strike. The officers descended from the attic in silence. Each step down the ladder felt heavier than the one before. Outside, the wind swept over the fields as though nothing had changed. But inside the farmhouse, the truth had begun to take shape. Someone had not only taken their lives. In the days following the discovery of the bodies, Hinterkaifeck, the quiet, isolated farm that once held a single family, became something else entirely. A place that no longer breathed with life, but with unanswered questions that seemed to seep from every doorway, every broken window, every shallow print in the snow. Investigators walked its grounds slowly, almost cautiously, not because of danger, but because of the unnerving stillness that clung to the air. A stillness that felt as though it had been waiting for them. Inside the barn, dust remained suspended in the air like frozen time. Straw lay undisturbed except where the bodies had been found, and the old farm tools stood silent against the walls, as if watching the intrusion. The investigators kept returning to this space, its strange magnetic pull impossible to ignore. Whoever had committed the murders had lured the victims here one by one. That alone hinted at something chilling. The killer had not rushed. They had waited. They had watched. They had acted with a patience that suggested familiarity or confidence. Unlike crimes driven by impulse, the scene bore the signature of someone who understood human behavior well enough to anticipate reactions. Someone who could predict how each member of the Gruber family would respond to a sound outside the farmhouse. It required more than brutality. It required psychological insight. And that insight is what disturbed the investigators most. It meant the killer did not simply attack the family. They guided them into their deaths. Inside the main farmhouse, footprints overlapped in hallways where daily life had abruptly ended. Chairs remained pulled slightly away from tables. A lamp sat burned out, as though someone had attempted to read or write the night before, unaware that those small acts of routine would be their final human touches. The beds were rumpled in ways that did not suggest struggle, only abrupt departure. As if each person had risen with the same sense of duty or curiosity and had walked toward silence. In the kitchen, investigators found the faint smell of meals cooked days earlier. A pot remained on the stove. Bread lay on the counter. Nothing had been cleared away. That alone shifted the atmosphere from eerie to horrifying. It suggested that after the murders, someone had stayed in the house. Someone had cooked. Someone had eaten. Someone had continued living among the bodies as if the killings were merely the first step in something larger. This was the moment when suspicion turned into fear. Not fear of the killer's strength or intent, but fear of their calmness, their patience, their willingness to inhabit the home of the dead for days. As if wearing the family's life as a disguise, some investigators whispered theories quietly, almost ashamed to speak them aloud. Perhaps the killer had been watching the family for months. Perhaps they had already known where tools were kept, which doors creaked, which steps groaned beneath a person's weight. Perhaps the killer had even slept in the house before the murders, an idea supported by the strange footprints found in the snow days earlier, footprints that led toward the house but never away from it. Every small detail narrowed the list of possibilities while widening the mystery itself. If the killer knew the family, they would have understood the dark secrets hidden within its walls, secrets whispered by neighbors, implied by the strained relationships, and hinted at by the oppressive atmosphere of the farmhouse. But if the killer was a stranger, then their behavior bordered on something far more unsettling. Why would a stranger stay? Why would they linger long after the violence had ended? By the end of the examination, investigators found themselves standing outside the farmhouse, staring back at it with a quiet dread. The building loomed in the gathering twilight, weathered and solemn, a silent witness to events that refused to explain themselves. And though the investigators left the property physically, their minds remained trapped within its walls, and no matter how many times they revisited the facts, the same unanswerable truth resurfaced. Someone had lived inside Hinterkaifeck after its inhabitants had been slaughtered. Someone had walked its floors, eaten its food, and slept beneath its roof, calm and unbothered, as though the farm belonged to them now. Night settled over the fields as investigators departed, their lanterns dimming one by one. And with darkness came the unsettling thought they couldn't shake, one that lingered long after footsteps faded. If the killer had felt so comfortable remaining at Hinterkaifeck, what was stopping them from returning? Chapter 5. The Search for a Motive. In the days after the discovery at Hinterkaifeck, investigators walked the farm again and again, searching for something that would explain why this happened. The tragedy was already known across Bavaria, whispered in markets and train stations, retold in quiet voices as if the land itself might be listening. But beneath the horror lingered a deeper puzzle, one that refused to reveal itself. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was burned. Nothing was broken beyond what the killer had already done. This was not the pattern of bandits or desperate men. It was something colder, something deliberate. Detectives studied the layout of the house, The animals left untouched in the barn, the orderly arrangement of tools, and the eerie signs of life that had continued after the murders. They walked the narrow wooden hallway where footprints settled into soft dust. They stood in the kitchen, where a faint warmth still seemed to hold onto the memory of recent meals cooked by a stranger. A killer who felt no urgency. A killer who stayed. Every detail suggested planning, and patience, and familiarity. Investigators began asking themselves a question no one wanted to say aloud. Did the killer know the family? It was not impossible. In fact, several clues pointed to someone who understood Hinterkaifeck intimately. The footprints leading to the stable suggested confidence in the property's layout. The movement around the house indicated someone who knew which doors creaked, which floorboards groaned, which shadows could be used to hide. The bodies had been moved into the barn, covered neatly. Almost ritualistically, it did not feel like the work of a stranger. But if the killer knew them, who would hate them enough for this? Detectives began examining the family's life more closely. They revisited old disputes, quiet conflicts, whispered rumors from town. The Gruber family had lived in isolation, both physically and emotionally. Their nearest neighbors were a long walk away. Their relationships within the village were strained. Some avoided them entirely. Others spoke reluctantly, as though fearful that the walls of the station were not thick enough to contain their words. Stories emerged of arguments, of distrust, of a house filled with tension long before the killer arrived. The isolation that had once protected the farm now worked against understanding what happened inside it. Yet the strangest motive theory came not from the family's past, but from the days just before the murders. The caretaker who heard footsteps in the attic. The missing keys. The newspaper no one in the family subscribed to. The sound of someone walking in the night while the winds pressed against the roof. All of these details felt connected, like pieces of an unfinished sentence. Investigators carefully pieced together a timeline. Someone had been watching the farm. Someone had been approaching for days, maybe longer. The murders were not impulsive. They were not opportunistic. They seemed inevitable. But why? Theories grew from every unanswered question. Some believed it was revenge. Others suspected a deeply personal feud. Some hinted at secrets within the household that had never been fully addressed. A few villagers even whispered that the land itself was cursed, that the remoteness of Hinterkaifeck had drawn evil to its doorstep. But detectives did not believe in curses. They believed in cause and effect. And here, the cause remained hidden, buried beneath fear, silence, and time.as days turned into weeks. The case refused to take shape. Witnesses contradicted each other. Clues led nowhere. The farm, now empty and cold, offered no final revelation. And every theory, no matter how logical, dissolved in the face of a simple, haunting reality. The killer had vanished as quietly as he had arrived. No one saw him leave. No one heard footsteps returning to the woods. No wagons were reported on the roads. No horses were taken. No strangers passed through the nearby towns. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed him. And while investigators searched desperately for motive, they were missing something even more important. The next piece of the killer's movement. The next hint of purpose. Something that would not be understood until much later. Something that suggested the killer might have been closer than anyone thought. Tracks in the snow, shadows in the walls. The days following the discovery of the Hinterkaifeck bodies moved with a strange heaviness. Investigators walked across the farmyard in slow, deliberate lines, their boots sinking into a mix of half-melted snow and damp earth. The air carried a stillness that felt unnatural, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Nothing moved except crows circling overhead, silent watchers above a home that had already fallen into legend. Inside the house, every room told a story. Not in words, in impressions, in the way dust had settled, in the way objects remained precisely where the family had left them. Investigators searched for signs of a break-in, for overturned furniture, for any evidence of a struggle. But the rooms looked strangely undisturbed. Beds made, clothes folded, dishes stacked neatly. The kind of normal domestic order that stood in eerie contrast to the brutality hidden inside the barn. This contradiction unsettled the investigators. Whoever committed the murders did not act in panic or haste. They behaved as though the house belonged to them, walking freely, making decisions, touching objects, and moving through hallways in calm, measured steps. The lack of disorder was not comforting. It was chilling. They moved next to the kitchen. A fire had been lit in the stove sometime after the murders. The ashes were still soft and pale. Someone had warmed themselves here. Someone had eaten here. The killer, or killers, had lived in the house after the crime, maintaining an unsettling domestic rhythm as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Local villagers provided their own memories. One recalled seeing smoke rising from the chimney after the family had already been dead. Another noticed that the animals were fed. The cows had not cried out from hunger. The dog had been seen roaming outside, then locked away again. These observations formed a timeline that was impossible to ignore. The killer stayed for days. The investigators returned to the barn and examined the hay piled over the bodies. The placement was too deliberate to be rushed. It suggested calm, careful concealment. Yet no footprints other than the family's and the investigators could be identified clearly. Snow had melted. Mud had shifted. Time had erased what might have once been obvious, the forest line beyond the fields. They found a set of footprints leading toward the woods. The prints grew shallow, then disappeared completely where the ground turned rocky. The investigators followed for hours, weaving between the trees, searching for broken branches or disturbed soil. But the forest kept its secrets. No scent, no scrap of cloth, no direction that felt certain. It was as though the figure walking away had simply dissolved into the landscape. Inside the main bedroom, small clues suggested the killer had lingered. A lamp moved slightly from its original place. A chair positioned near the window, as though someone had sat quietly, watching the long path that led to the road. A strange sense of presence remained, lingering in the still air, clinging to the walls, almost whispering from the corners. One investigator remarked quietly to another that houses rarely feel empty after tragedy. They feel occupied by the memory of what happened. But Hinterkaifeck felt different. It felt occupied by someone who had not been caught, someone who might return, someone who perhaps never really left. The barn was revisited as the sun began to dip behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the stalls. Investigators tried to understand why the killer had drawn the family there one by one. There were signs the first victim had been attacked near the entrance, struck immediately with force that suggested both strength and precision. The others entered later, for reasons unknown. They did not run. They did not scream loud enough for neighbors to hear. They entered willingly, perhaps expecting to help someone or to solve some disturbance in the night. This detail haunted investigators. What had they heard? Who had they followed? What had been said in those final moments before silence swallowed the barn? The more investigators studied the scene, the more questions grew. Why attack in the barn instead of the house? Why remain afterward? Why take nothing of value? Why linger near the bodies? Why maintain the farm as though it were still a functioning home? Each question deepened the mystery instead of narrowing it. Hinterkaifeck was a puzzle with missing edges. Every clue pointed toward intention, yet none pointed toward motive. And without motive, every theory felt incomplete. The wind picked up as investigators finished their second full day on the property. The sky dimmed to a cold gray. The house creaked softly as if reacting to the drop in temperature. The barn settled with the weight of the coming night, and the fields beyond darkened into a single, unbroken sheet of shadow. No-one wanted to remain on the farm after sunset. Not because of superstition, though whispers had already begun spreading through the village, but because there was something unsettlingly alive about the house. Something watching. Something remembering. As investigators stepped away from the farm, lanterns swinging gently in their hands. A last look behind them revealed a silhouette framed in the upper window. It wasn't a person. It was just the shape of the room against the dying light. But it lingered long enough to leave an impression, a reminder that Hinterkaifeck was not finished giving up its secrets, and not done holding them, either. In the days after the murders, the Hinterkaifeck farm did not fall quiet in the way most farms do after tragedy. It fell quiet in a different way, a quiet that felt inhabited. Neighbors approached cautiously. Some stood at the gate and refused to walk further. Others insisted that something was wrong the moment they stepped onto the property. Not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt inside the house. Investigators continued their slow search. Dust hung in the light like drifting snow. Footsteps sounded too loudly in the hallway, as if the house had grown and used to voices. Rooms felt lived in yet disturbed, preserved yet wrong. Nothing was overturned. Nothing showed the chaos you would expect after such a crime. Instead, everything held a strange stillness, like the house itself was holding its breath. One investigator later described it quietly to a colleague. It felt like someone had just stepped out of the room a moment before we walked in. The barn remained the darkest part of the property, its wooden beams soaked in light only at midday. Its edges were full of corners the lanterns could not reach. Each time investigators re-entered, they were struck by how the place seemed to remember what had happened there even when no one spoke of it. Forensic science in 1922 offered little guidance. There were no modern tools to NO profiles, NO databases. Everything depended on observation, intuition, and the willingness to stand inside a silent house long enough to understand its rhythm. But Hinterkaifeck resisted understanding. The footprints in the snow told one story. The locked doors told another. The uneaten food suggested routine. The hay in the barn suggested occupancy. But none of these pieces locked together cleanly. It was as if the events of that night had been arranged by someone who understood confusion intimately. Someone who knew how to erase meaning without erasing evidence. Authorities interviewed neighbors again and again. Every repetition raised new uncertainties. The noises they'd heard, the shadows they'd noticed, the uneasy feelings some had described days before the bodies were found. The family dog, who had been both restless and quiet at strange times, became another loose thread in a story already full of frayed ends. More troubling were the reports about smoke rising from the chimney after the murders. Someone had tended the fire. Someone had lived with the bodies. Someone had stayed long enough to make the house feel inhabited. Theories emerged quickly that a stranger passing through, that a vagrant hiding in the woods, that a criminal with a motive no one understood. But the investigators noticed something quietly unsettling, a detail easily missed. There were signs of familiarity, signs that the killer moved through the house without hesitation, signs that whoever stayed there knew its layout, its doors, its noises. This possibility shifted the investigation into a darker direction. If the killer knew the house, knew the family, or had been watching them closely before that night, then the crime was not random. It was intentional. In the surrounding villages, people spoke less as the days went on, not out of fear of gossip, but out of fear of naming someone they might see at the market the next morning, fear of accusing someone who might walk past their window at night. Silence became a kind of protection, but silence also became a barrier, trapping investigators inside a maze of half-truths. By the end of the first week, the farm felt colder, not physically, emotionally. The house no longer felt like a place where a family had lived. It felt like a location awaiting explanation, a puzzle without edges, a story missing its final line. Some officers refused to stay past sunset. Others insisted they heard footsteps when no one else was inside the barn. One described the sensation of being watched from behind, though the yard was empty. These were not details entered into official reports. They were the quiet confessions shared among investigators who knew that something about Hinterkaifeck was fundamentally wrong. And in that wrongness, the mystery deepened, not toward clarity, but toward a silence so complete that even the truth seemed reluctant to speak. The killer had vanished. The motive had vanished. The trail had grown cold before it even began. All that remained was the house, standing alone, still, waiting to if the walls themselves knew more than anyone else would ever discover. Chapter 6, Segment 1. A house that would not let go. By the spring of 1922, the Hinterkaifeck farm had stopped feeling like an ordinary home. The walls still stood. The fields still stretched outward in quiet lines. But something inside the property had shifted. The Gruber family moved through their routines as if watched by an unseen presence, something close enough to touch the air, but never close enough to identify. Days were filled with the familiar tasks of farm life, yet every task carried a thin thread of unease. Victoria noticed it first, not in dramatic moments, but in the smallest details. The way the stable doors she knew she'd closed the night before appeared slightly open in the morning. The faint sound of steps on the hay when no animals were nearby. The sense that someone had walked ahead of her into a room she knew she had left empty. She didn't speak about it at first. On the farm, work always came before fear. But fear has its own rhythm, and soon it began to shape her days. Andreas, stern and unyielding by nature, carried tension without admitting it. He believed in order, in discipline, in routine. Anything that disrupted routine felt like a challenge to his authority. That made it even harder for him to acknowledge the signs. Footprints in the snow that led toward the house, but not away from it. Hay disturbed in the loft as if someone had lain there. Tools missing, then reappearing in odd places. These were not random mistakes. They were patterns. Patterns that pressed against his sense of control. Even young Kazilia sensed something changing. Children do not need explanations to feel danger. They feel it the way they feel cold air before a storm. She began waking in the night without knowing why. She lay quietly in bed, listening to the house breathe. Sometimes she heard a soft rustle, like clothing brushing against wood. Sometimes she heard nothing, and that silence frightened her even more. She grew restless, tired, and strangely withdrawn. Though she tried to hide it from her mother, Maria arrived last. She was new to the farm, arriving unaware of the history, the recent strange events, or the quiet unrest that had settled in. For her, everything felt new. The creaking floors, the echoing barn, the isolation that stretched like an ocean around the property. But even she sensed something the first night. A feeling of being in a place that had already been claimed by someone she could not see. Inside the family, the approaching sense of dread carried different meanings. For Andreas, it was irritation, something disrupting his sense of order. For Victoria, it was a warning, one she wished she could interpret. For the children, it was fear they did not understand how to name. For Maria, it was a question. Why did each family member seem tense when the house was so quiet? Outside the house, the world continued in its usual rhythm. Neighbors passed by rarely. The farm sat far from town, separated from the world by long fields and narrow paths. At a distance, the property looked peaceful. A modest farmhouse, a barn, a family living a country life. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. But the distance hid the truth. It hid the way the lights sometimes flickered in late hours. It hid the way the dog barked at empty corners. It hid the way the family held their breaths at night, listening for sounds that should not exist, and the house itself held these secrets carefully. The walls absorbed them. The floors muted them. The rooms contained the tension like trapped breath. It was as if the structure had stopped being a shelter and had become something else entirely, an observer, a witness, a quiet keeper of whatever moved within it. There were moments when the family considered leaving. The thought crossed their minds more often than they admitted. A farm is a life, not a possession, and abandoning it would mean surrendering everything they had built. But fear has a way of convincing people that staying is safer simply because staying is familiar. And so they stayed. They worked. They endured the odd disturbances. They convinced themselves that the uneasy feeling would eventually fade, but it didn't fade. It grew, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like frost forming overnight. Step by step, day by day, the unseen presence inside Hinterkaifeck settled deeper, as if it knew the family would not leave, as if it waited. And in those final weeks before everything changed, the house seemed to breathe around them, slow, deliberate, aware. The Grubers did not know it yet, but something had already crossed the threshold, something patient, something silent, something that had no intention of ever leaving. By the second night after the murders, investigators no longer spoke loudly inside the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse. Their voices had softened, not out of respect alone, but out of unease. Every sound lingered too long in the cold air. Footsteps echoed as if someone else were walking behind them. Doors moved with a weight that suggested more hands than the living could account for. The strange warmth found in the house on the first day was still present. The kitchen stove had been used again. Ashes in the iron grate were fresh. Bread had been cut. Milk had been poured. Someone had eaten a meal here while the family lay dead just meters away. And that fact settled around the investigators like a slow tightening rope. They searched the upstairs rooms again. Nothing was disturbed. Children's toys remained arranged as they had been. A doll propped against the wall stared with blank, patient eyes. It felt as though the killer had walked these same halls after the murders, pausing at thresholds, studying the rooms in silence. As though he allowed himself time, not panic. Downstairs, one of the officers opened a small cabinet and found blankets missing. Another noted that the livestock had been fed yet again. The cows were calm. The chickens, too. Someone had cared for these animals methodically, as though maintaining the normal rhythm of the farm was part of a larger design. Something the killer needed to uphold. Outside, Investigators pushed deeper into the barn, studying the packed hay, the footprints, the narrow angles between beams. The killer had used this space deliberately. He had chosen it for the ambush, chosen it for the silence it offered, chosen it because once the first blow fell, no one inside the farmhouse could hear the next. Yet what frightened investigators most was not the brutality of the crime. It was the calm that followed it. The killer had stayed here, lived here, slept here, not for a moment, but possibly for days, moving through the rooms as if they belonged to him, tending to chores, lighting lanterns, stoking fires. A guest in a home where every host had been silenced. By late evening, lantern light trembled along the farmhouse walls. Investigators stood in the doorway of the parents' room, noting again the indentation on the bed. Someone had rested there, not briefly, long enough to leave the sheets pulled and wrinkled, long enough to shape the fabric with the outline of a body no one could identify. Outside, wind moved through the trees, carrying a soft hiss that blended with the unease inside the walls. The officers were beginning to understand a truth far more unsettling than any they had expected. The murders were not the end of the crime. They were the beginning of a presence that had settled over Hinterkaifeck, silent and patient. And as the lanterns burned low, the investigators realized something else. Whoever had lived in this house after the murders had not simply been hiding, that he had been waiting. Night came early on the Hinterkaifeck farm, especially in winter. As the heavy dark settled over the isolated property, the world beyond the tree-line disappeared completely. The house seemed to float in a sea of black forest, the edges of the farm swallowed by shadows that moved when the wind deepened. Inside, the lanterns burned low, giving the rooms the same muted quiet that the family had grown used to long before anything terrible ever happened. But now, silence on the farm no longer felt empty. It felt aware. The family tried to continue their evenings as normally as possible. The chores were done. The animals were settled. The children were tucked away, their whispers fading into sleep. Yet every adult in the house felt the same quiet tension running beneath the surface. It was not spoken openly. It lived in small moments instead. The way someone paused before crossing a dark room. The way footsteps slowed before opening a door. The way each person listened for sounds they could not name. Even the animals sensed something. The cows moved restlessly in their stalls. The dog paced near the entrance, ears twitching toward the woods. Horses shifted with subtle unease, as if reacting to something beyond human perception. There were no visible threats. No footprints in the fresh evening frost. No voices drifting through the trees. And yet the farm breathed like it was being watched. Whispers of movement inside the attic continued in the quiet. Just small enough to dismiss. Just loud enough to stay in the mind. A soft shift of wood. A faint step. A breath of weight settling on old boards. The family told themselves it was the wind. They told themselves houses make sounds. But no one truly believed that anymore. After the discovery of strange footprints days earlier, every sound carried new meaning. The idea that someone might be living inside the house, hidden among the beams and dust, felt too terrifying to discuss. So no one brought it up. They only listened, hoping the noise would prove harmless by disappearing. But it did not disappear. On this night, the sound returned, soft, slow, deliberate. It was not frantic like a wild animal, not irregular like settling wood. It had intention, rhythm. It moved as though pacing, as though choosing where to stand. The family sat in the main room together, pretending not to hear it. No one looked up toward the ceiling. No one acknowledged the truth forming like frost around them. They only sat with the uncomfortable awareness that something shared the house with them, and that acknowledging it would make everything real. Outside, the woods pressed closer. The branches swayed as if brushing against something unseen. The farm felt smaller, boxed in by a darkness that did not behave like ordinary night. Even the air held stillness, as though waiting. The lantern's flame flickered once, stretching shadows across the walls. In that moment, each person in the room felt the same chill, a sense that they were no longer alone in the house. It was not fear of the attic itself. It was fear of what kind of person could stay hidden so long. Someone patient. Someone familiar with the property. Someone comfortable enough to move without rush. Someone who had watched them before they ever noticed. Eventually, bedtime came. Doors closed softly. Footsteps settled into the boards. Silence spread again. A fragile silence, stretched thin by the tension underneath. Hours passed. Then, sometime in the darkest part of the night, the attic creaked again. The slow, deliberate footstep. Then another. Pausing, listening, choosing. It moved with care, as if mapping the house from above. Knowing exactly which boards would give sound, which walls connected to which rooms. Outside, the wind rose just enough to cover the faint movement inside. The trees swayed. The barn groaned. But beneath all of it, inside the farmhouse, the presence remained. Close, patient, unhurried. In '01 and the family stirred, though each of them felt something shift in the night. As if the house were breathing differently. As if the walls themselves held a secret waiting for dawn. By morning, everything would look the same. The yard, the barn, the snow, the rooms, the quiet. But the sense of being watched would not fade. It had become part of the farm, moving through each hallway and doorway like cold air. Whatever lived inside the attic had not come and gone. It had settled in. And the farm, once just a quiet place in the countryside, now felt like a stage being prepared for something none of them could yet imagine. Something already approaching, step by slow step, in the darkness above their heads. Chapter 7. The Stranger Who Walked the Farm. By the 7th day after the murders, investigators in Hinterkaifeck began to understand something unsettling, something they had not wanted to believe earlier. The killer had not simply entered the farm, taken lives, and vanished into the woods that he had stayed. He had stayed long enough for the house to breathe again after the violence, long enough for the livestock to settle into their routines, long enough for small domestic tasks to continue as if life had not ended inside those walls. This single realization altered the direction of the entire investigation, because a person who kills and flees is one kind of threat. A person who kills and then lives among the dead is another entirely. The farm still carried signs of recent habitation. Bread had been sliced, milk had been poured, animals had been fed, ashes in the fireplace were fresh. Even the family dog had been heard barking at strangers, but not at the familiar steps moving through the courtyard at night. This was not a random intrusion. It was a presence, a slow, unhurried presence that belonged to someone who felt no fear of being discovered, or someone who knew that no one was coming quickly enough to interrupt him. The neighbors later told investigators that smoke had risen from the chimney in the days after the murders. They assumed the family was inside, tending to the farm as always. No one imagined that footsteps in the barn belonged to a man who had already taken 6 lives. This quiet continuation of daily life became one of the darkest elements of the case, because it meant the killer had blended into the rhythm of the farm, walking on floors still stained, breathing in the same rooms where silence had settled heavy, using tools and food belonging to the dead as if nothing had transpired. Some investigators believe the killer remained on the property for at least 3 days. Others thought it may have been longer. The exact duration was never agreed upon, but the details painted a consistent picture. The murderer behaved like a man living in a familiar place. He fed the cattle because the animals' distressed calls would attract attention. He lit the lanterns at night because the farm looked wrong when left entirely dark. That he used the kitchen because hunger remained unchanged by what he had done. This level of calm, this eerie domestic patience, suggested 2 possibilities. The first, the killer had known the family intimately. The second, he possessed a mind capable of compartmentalizing horror in ways that ordinary people could not comprehend. Investigators leaned toward the former, because the farm was isolated, because the family trusted few, because only someone familiar could move across creaking floors without hesitation. But the second possibility lingered like a cold draft through the abandoned house. Whoever the intruder was, he moved with confidence. He navigated the rooms without lantern light at times. He selected tools and food as if he knew where everything was kept. There were moments during the investigation when police stood in the rooms and tried to imagine the scene. A man sitting at the wooden table, eating quietly while the bodies lay only steps away, a figure folding the bed covers as if preparing to sleep in a home no longer alive. Someone listening to the wind outside the barn door, unbothered by the lifeless silence around him. The investigators felt it even after the bodies had been removed, a residue of presence, a sense that someone had occupied the space longer than anyone dared to admit. And the most chilling detail came from the lantern wick, freshly adjusted, trimmed with care, used by hands steady enough to work in darkness without urgency. This was not panic. This was patience. The kind of patience that belonged to a person who believed he owned the place, or who believed no one would challenge him. As night fell around the farm on those post-murder evenings, the fields grew silent. But inside the house, the light still flickered. A stranger walked the halls. A stranger exhaled softly in the bedrooms where the family once slept. A stranger lived in the void he had created. And that presence, unseen yet undeniable, became the turning point of the entire investigation. Because if the killer stayed, then someone, somewhere, knew him. Night on the Hinterkaifeck farm was never silent. Even before the murders, the Gruber family often spoke of sounds that didn't belong to the land. Soft shifting in the barn, footsteps muffled in hay, the distant groan of old wood bending under an unseen weight. But after the discovery of the hidden newspaper and the set of strange tracks appearing from the forest without returning, the nights began to feel heavier, as if the darkness itself had learned how to watch. Inside the farmhouse, lanterns burned longer than usual. Victoria checked each window before latching it, even though she knew wooden shutters could stop almost nothing. Cazilia's eyes followed her mother anxiously, sensing an unspoken fear in every hurried movement. Even little Joseph fussed more often, startled by sounds the adults pretended not to hear. The family was still functioning, feeding the animals, tending to the fields, but something in their routine had changed. There was a tension in the air, a quiet alertness, a sense that every task was being done with half a mind listening for something just outside the edge of light. And outside, the farm breathed differently. Wind pushed through the trees in irregular gusts. Branches tapped windows like knuckles. The barn's tall doors, even when barred, shuddered as if gently tested. The animals behaved strangely too. Cows paced in their stalls, restless. The dog, a loyal and normally steady animal, refused to sleep near the barn at all. Instead, he lay pressed against the door of the house, staring toward the dark path leading into the woods. Every so often he growled softly, not in fear, but in recognition that it was clear to everyone in the family that someone had been watching the farm. But they tried to dismiss it. Life in rural Germany was hard enough without adding ghosts or intruders to the list of daily worries. Yet no explanation felt solid. The newspaper left in the snow came from a region none of them had visited. Footprints appeared during calm weather, too neat to have been shaped by drifting ice or wind. And every night, when Andreas stepped outside to check the barn, he felt a sensation he could never articulate, a prickle along the spine, as though someone was holding their breath nearby. More than once, he stopped in the yard, listening. Nothing. Only the cold air humming between the buildings. But he sensed it anyway and observed a measured eye in the evenings. When the family gathered at the table for supper, they spoke quietly about these disturbances. They tried to propose practical explanations, travelers seeking shelter, hunters passing through, a neighbor playing tricks. But none of those ideas survived long under scrutiny. The Grubers were not a family with friendly neighbors. They lived on the outskirts not by accident, but by reputation. Few people visited them. Fewer wanted to. As the nights grew colder, the sense of being watched intensified. Even simple tasks, like walking to the barn to gather firewood, felt strangely exposed. Victoria took to glancing over her shoulder as she crossed the courtyard. Young Cazilia, normally fearless, refused to go anywhere alone once the sun dipped below the tree line. She said she heard breathing in the walls at night. Her grandmother dismissed it as childish imagination, but her voice trembled when she said it. One evening, while the lanterns flickered weakly in the winter wind, Andreas thought he heard someone moving hay inside the barn. He stepped out with a lantern, calling into the darkness, his voice echoing off the wooden beams. No response, only the swaying outlines of tools and the soft movements of animals shifting uneasily as he passed. Still, he felt something there, something that resisted the light, something that waited for him to leave. He stayed longer than he needed to, pretending to inspect equipment, hoping sound or shadow would betray whatever lingered. But the barn remained silent, as if holding its secrets tightly. Back inside, the rest of the family was already preparing for bed. Andreas lingered at the door, watching the outline of the barn from the threshold. Snow began to fall gently over the roofs, muting the world. In that eerie quiet, He thought he saw movement. Just a flicker, just enough to catch the corner of his vision. But when he looked again, nothing stirred. He shut the door slowly, but the feeling followed him into the house. The sense of an outsider growing comfortable, the sense of being studied, the sense of a presence settling into the farm with the patience of someone who knew they wouldn't be challenged. And across the property, hidden in winter's shadows, the watcher waited, patient, silent, already inside the world that would soon collapse. By the time night settled over the Hinterkaifeck farm on that last evening, the world outside remained unaware that the family inside its wooden walls was already gone. Snow drifted across the yard in thin sheets, guided by a cold wind that moved like breath through the trees. The house itself looked peaceful from a distance, a warm structure with a familiar shape against the winter dark. But inside, stillness had taken root in the worst possible way. No fire burned, no voices rose, no footsteps crossed the floorboards, yet there were signs of someone living there. Small signs, subtle signs, signs that did not belong to those who should have been alive. The cattle had not been fed on schedule, but they had not starved. Someone had tossed hay into their stalls. The dog barked less that night, as though the presence he sensed no longer felt like a stranger. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney at one point, as if a single log had been added to a dying fire only to keep the illusion of life visible to anyone who might walk by. The house showed traces of movement, but none of them were natural. They were the gestures of someone passing through a space that was not theirs. Someone with no reason to hide, because there was no one left to see. Inside, the rooms remained untouched from the moment violence had taken them. The killer had not disturbed the bodies after dragging them where they now lay. He had only moved around them, as though the house still belonged to him in some twisted, temporary way. He slept in beds that were not his. He prepared meals with tools that did not belong to him. He waited out the hours in silence, listening for footsteps on the road, for voices, for anything that might break the solitude. But no one came. The world outside continued on, unaware of the darkness settling deeper into the walls that in the barn. The bodies of the Gruber family rested under layers of hay, an attempt to muffle the truth for as long as possible. Victoria, her parents, her daughter, all hidden beneath the quiet weight of straw. And inside the house, young Joseph and the maid, Maria, remained where they had fallen. 6 lives ended. 6 quiet absences filling every corner of the property. The killer seemed to know he had time. The remoteness of the farm worked in his favor. Neighbors did not visit often. Mail did not come daily. Days could pass without interruption. So he lingered, moving through the rooms with a calm that felt unnatural. The longer he stayed, the more unsettling his presence became. He acted not like someone rushing to escape a crime, but like someone completing a ritual. Someone waiting for the right moment to vanish. On that final night, a lamp burned low in one of the rooms. It flickered softly against the window, casting faint shadows across the snow. From a distance, it would appear as though the family was simply preparing for bed. No one could imagine that the hand lighting the lamp was not a member of the family at all, that it belonged to the person who had ended them at some point in the early hours of the morning. The killer prepared to leave. Not hurried, not frantic, calm, measured. He extinguished the light, checked the animals, closed the doors behind him with careful precision. There was no sign of struggle in his departure, only a slow, deliberate exit into the cold Bavarian night. The farm fell quiet again. The house, now empty of all life, returned to darkness. Footprints in the snow faded through the night, erased by drifting wind. The world remained unaware of what had taken place behind the wooden walls. And by the time neighbors would finally begin to question the smoke they had not seen, the silence they could no longer ignore, and the chores that seemed strangely tended to, the killer would already be gone. Gone without a trace, gone without being seen, gone in a way that suggested he had always known how much time he had. This was the final night before discovery, the last moment before the truth began to surface, and the beginning of a mystery that would outlive everyone who stepped foot onto that farm the next day. Chapter 8. The Search for the Stranger. The investigation moved into its most fragile phase when detectives turned their attention outward, past the family, past the neighbors, past the small circle of village life, and toward the possibility that the killer had come from somewhere else entirely. Hinterkaifeck was isolated enough to conceal a stranger, quiet enough for footsteps to vanish into the wind, and remote enough for a visitor to remain unseen for days without raising alarm. Investigators began retracing every road into the valley, each path that cut across the forests, and every place where a traveler might have paused long enough to notice the farmhouse standing alone against the fields. They interviewed farmers who lived miles away, wagon drivers who passed through only at dawn, and merchants who walked the long trade routes between villages. Many had seen nothing unusual. Others remembered small details: an unfamiliar figure near a fence line, a man walking at dusk carrying a satchel, a shape moving at the edge of the woods where shadows collect early. None of the descriptions matched each other. None aligned neatly enough to form a suspect. But they did reveal something investigators already feared. Strangers passed through the region more often than anyone had realized, and any one of them could have watched the family without being noticed. The theory emerged quietly. Perhaps the killer had not been driven by personal hatred or family conflict. Perhaps he had stumbled upon the farmhouse by chance, drawn by its isolation, by its promise of shelter, or by something darker. The idea unsettled the investigators because it widened the circle of possibility into something immeasurable. Instead of focusing on known connections, they were now staring into the anonymity of the open road, into faces without names, into footsteps without histories. It meant the killer might have been someone the family had never met. Detectives examined guest registries from nearby inns, though many travelers never signed their real names. They looked into laborers moving between seasonal jobs, but records were poor, and most identities relied on memory alone. The longer they worked, the clearer it became that the region offered perfect cover for someone who wanted to disappear. A stranger could arrive, watch, wait, and leave long before anyone realized he had been there at all. Rumors spread quietly through the villages. Some believed the killer was a vagrant who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. Others felt certain he was a soldier who had returned from the war, changed beyond recognition. Fear magnified every detail. If a stranger spoke too softly, people whispered. If he passed through too quickly, people wondered. The presence of an outsider, once merely notable, now cast a shadow over every road and every inn. Investigators pursued each rumor with patient determination. They questioned a traveling carpenter whose coat resembled a description given by a distant farmer. They tracked down a tanner who had slept under a bridge the night of the murders. They even followed the story of a man seen near a rail crossing days before the crime. Someone who lingered longer than necessary, staring toward the direction of the farm. Each lead dissolved slowly under scrutiny. Alibis held. Distances made timelines impossible. Strangers slipped through their hands like smoke. Yet one observation remained impossible to ignore. Whoever killed the family seemed to know far more about the farmhouse than a passing visitor should. He moved through the property with ease. He found tools without searching. He entered the living quarters without confusion. He stayed inside for days without fear of being discovered. These details suggested familiarity, either acquired through previous visits or through careful, deliberate watching. This tension between the stranger theory and the intimate details of the crime created a quiet divide among investigators. Some believed the killer had arrived from far away, driven by desperation or madness. Others insisted the murderer must have watched the family for weeks, learning their routines, their vulnerabilities, the times when the farmhouse was quiet. Both possibilities were unsettling. Both felt plausible, and both pointed to a predator who moved with patience, not impulse. Days turned into weeks. The search expanded outward, following the thin lines of roads that led into the hills and then disappeared into forests. Investigators felt the distance growing, between themselves and the truth, between the murders and the faint trail the killer had left behind. The stranger theory, once hopeful in its clarity, dissolved into a vast landscape of uncertainty. If the killer had come from the outside, he could now be anywhere. Yet the story did not end with the widening search. The farmhouse itself continued whispering reminders that someone had been inside, long after the family was gone. As investigators dug deeper into the strange silence surrounding Hinterkaifeck, they began to revisit every voice connected to the farm. Every neighbor, every laborer, every passing traveler who had ever stopped near the property. But instead of clarity, their interviews revealed something else. An entire community woven with hesitation, secrets, and a reluctance that never fully lifted. People in the nearby village remembered things only in fragments. They recalled the family as distant, quiet, self-contained. They recalled odd events, but never spoke of them earlier. They recalled suspicions, but never shared them until after the tragedy. It was as if the murders had unlocked memories that had long been sealed behind politeness and fear. Some villagers admitted that they had heard strange noises coming from the woods weeks before the killings. Others mentioned seeing the farm's lantern lit late at night when no one should have been awake. A few whispered that they had always felt an uneasiness when passing the isolated property, but each story carried the same tone. A tone that said, "We noticed something, but we convinced ourselves it was nothing." In those interviews, investigators sensed a deeper truth. The family had lived in quiet tension with the world around them. Not openly hostile, not openly close, simply suspended in a space that separated them from normal village life. The remoteness of the farm did not just isolate them physically, it isolated the flow of information. Strange events could occur, and no one would question them. Warnings could be missed without anyone realizing they were warnings. The investigators pressed further. They asked about footsteps heard in the snow, about the mysterious man believed to be watching the farm, about the sound of muffled voices drifting at night from a property that sat alone under the sky. The villagers answered in hesitant halves. Yes, some had heard things. Yes, some had noticed figures in the distance. No, none of them had thought it meant anything dangerous, and beneath their answers lay another unspoken reality. People feared becoming involved. They feared becoming targets of gossip or suspicion in a community where privacy was valued, and where rumors traveled faster than truth. In the aftermath of the murders, however, the silence broke open. Stories surfaced that, had they been shared earlier, might have painted a clearer picture of what was happening on the farm before the killings. Observations that seemed harmless at the time now appeared ominous. One villager recalled seeing a shadowy figure walking along the tree line near the farm weeks before the family died. Another had noticed smoke rising from the chimney on a day when the family was believed to be away. Someone else mentioned hearing the farm's dog barking through the night, but not in its usual pattern. It barked in intervals, as if reacting to footsteps moving slowly around the property. Each detail was small, yet together, they formed a mosaic of warning signs that no one had pieced together until much later. What troubled the investigators most was the lingering question: had the killer been present long before the murders? Had he lived among the villagers for days, watching, waiting, learning the rhythms of the household? Or had he been someone the community already knew, someone whose presence never raised suspicion? As the interviews continued, the feeling sharpened. The killer was not a figure from distant lands, not a wanderer passing through. He was someone connected, loosely or closely, to the quiet world surrounding the farm. But the most disturbing realization was this: if the villagers had seen so much without understanding it, then the killer had been hiding comfortably within their blind spots, and possibly still was. As the years slipped further from 1922, the Hinterkaifeck farm remained frozen in mystery. But the theories surrounding that night did not fade. If anything, time sharpened them, turning speculation into obsession, quiet rumors into elaborate reconstructions, and fragments of truth into entire narratives built on intuition rather than proof. One theory suggested that the killer had not come to the farm to murder at all. Instead, they had come to confront someone inside the house, perhaps Victor, the son who had already passed many months earlier. Some believed the killer thought Victor was still alive and responsible for a past wrongdoing, only to arrive and find a grieving family. According to this idea, the confrontation spiraled into bloodshed. But this theory rested on very little evidence. It required motive without witnesses, anger without a clear target, and behavior that left investigators unconvinced. Another theory, that the crime was financially motivated, appeared more structured. The family kept money hidden inside the house, avoiding banks entirely. They distrusted institutions and relied on physical currency stored in small boxes and envelopes. Anyone familiar with their habits would have known this. And yet, after the murders, the money remained untouched. If the killer had come to steal, they left without taking anything. Even food remained in the pantry. Robbery did not fit the pattern. Then came the theory many whispered but few spoke aloud in public, that someone close to the family was involved. The Grubers were not isolated by chance. They had withdrawn into their own world because the outside world rarely felt welcoming. Their private lives, especially the relationship between Andreas and Victoria, had often drawn quiet disapproval from neighbors. Some believed resentment had festered, that someone, somewhere, had carried a grievance long enough to let it change into something darker. But again, this theory struggled under the weight of missing evidence. Who held that grievance? And why strike on that particular night? Answers dissolved into speculation that a more chilling idea suggested not one killer, but several. The brutality of the murders, the methodical way each victim had been lured into the barn, and the patience shown by someone staying on the farm afterward. All of it could point to a group rather than an individual. A team could move more quickly, silence more easily, and maintain control with less risk. But if a group had been involved, why leave no signs of multiple movements? Why leave only a single set of impressions, a single pattern of behavior, a single calm presence inside the farmhouse? Another possibility pointed toward a stranger, someone passing through the region who stumbled upon the farm, saw opportunity in its isolation, and seized it with a kind of cold spontaneity. But the behavior after the murders weakened this theory. A stranger would have fled, yet the killer stayed. They moved through the home as though unafraid. They tended the fire. They milked the cows. They rested. This was not the behavior of someone desperate to escape. It felt like someone who understood the rhythms of farm life, someone who knew that night and day often passed quietly at Hinterkaifeck. And then there was the theory that unsettled even those who did not believe in superstition. A theory that suggested the killer had already lived on the farm long before the murders took place. The footsteps in the snow, the attic noises, the missing set of keys, the smoke rising from the chimney. All of it could be signs of someone hiding in the walls, the rafters, or the shadows, watching the family from above, learning their routines, waiting for a moment when everything aligned just right. This idea, while terrifying, aligned eerily with the facts. But no one could ever prove it. No bedding was found in the attic. No evidence of long-term hiding. Only the small disturbances that now felt too heavy to ignore. As investigators revisited the case over the decades, each theory rose and fell like slow tides. Some gained traction, others dissolved. In the end, none could be confirmed. The killer left no confession, no note, no slip of emotion that pointed clearly toward truth. Instead, the more time passed, the more the silence grew. And in that silence, the theories settled like dust, waiting for someone new to stir them again. And even now, a century later, those theories remain exactly where the killer left them. In darkness, in uncertainty, in a house that once held a family and now holds only questions that refuse to fade. Chapter 9. The investigators who arrived too late. Morning light fell softly across the snowy fields as the next wave of investigators made their way toward Hinterkaifeck. The farm looked calm from a distance, almost peaceful, its weathered barn and narrow footpath blending into the early spring landscape. Yet the closer they came, the more the silence around the property felt wrong, still, heavy, and shaped by something left behind. These investigators were not the first. Local officers had already walked the grounds. Neighbors had already stepped inside, and curious onlookers had crossed the threshold long before proper protocols were enforced. By the time the official team arrived, the crime scene had become a mosaic of footprints, fingerprints, and shifted objects, every clue blurred into noise. Still, the investigators approached with measured steps. They understood that even compromised spaces carry traces of truth. They began outside first, scanning the edges of the barn and the path leading to the forest line. The snow had melted unevenly, leaving patches of ground where footprints had once been sharp. Now they appeared softened, distorted by time, weather, and the passing of too many boots. Inside the barn, the air held a faint chill. Dust drifted in the slivers of sunlight that filtered through warped wooden boards. The investigators paused, not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight of the moment. They stood in the same place where the killer had once walked calmly, unhurried, confident enough to linger on the property after the act itself. One investigator noted the strange orderliness of the scene. In a crime driven by desperation or panic, chaos typically follows. But here, There were hints of routine, tools in their usual places, hay stacked neatly, objects arranged with no obvious sign of frantic movement. It was as if life had continued for a short while, as if someone had carried out tasks with quiet familiarity. Stepping into the living quarters, the team moved slowly through each room, studying the patterns of daily life that had been interrupted but not erased. Fires had been stoked days after the killings. Food had been eaten. The animals had been fed. Lamps had been lit at night. All of it pointed to a presence, someone who stayed, someone who was not afraid to remain. The investigators spoke softly, their voices low, as if raising them might disturb the thin veil of memory left in the air. They examined doorframes, window latches, the attic entrance, and the small crawl spaces behind the walls. Each detail suggested opportunity for movement, for watching, for listening. As they worked, the same question circled quietly through each mind. Who could stay here afterward? Who could walk these rooms without fear, knowing the world outside had not yet noticed what had happened? The investigators documented what they could, though they already sensed that many answers had slipped away in the hours before the farm was sealed. Evidence diluted by footsteps, timelines blurred by conversation, objects shifted innocently by helpful neighbors. Yet even with the contamination, one truth became unmistakable. Whoever had been here after the family died was not a passerby. They knew the rhythms of this house. They moved with confidence. They stayed long enough to blur the line between intruder and resident. The team stepped back out into the cold air, looking once more at the quiet fields around the home. The wind brushed through the trees, carrying with it the faint sounds of a world that had already resumed its pace. But for the investigators, the moment held stillness, a sense that the farm had been shaped by more than violence. It had been shaped by someone who understood isolation deeply enough to hide within it. And as they prepared to continue their work, they realized they were not only looking for a killer, they were looking for someone who could disappear into silence and wait. As the years passed, the Hinterkaifeck case stopped behaving like an investigation and began behaving like an echo. Every unanswered question created two more. Every detail that once seemed small became a doorway into another possibility. The crime did not fade. It multiplied in the imagination of anyone who studied it. One of the most enduring theories focused on the idea of a personal motive. Something intimate, something rooted in the family's private world. People whispered about old resentments, about strained relationships, about rumors that had circulated quietly in the village long before the murders. In a community as small as theirs, secrets did not stay buried for long, even if no one admitted knowing them. And yet, none of these whispers ever grew into anything solid. They remained fragments of suggestion, floating at the edge of certainty. Another theory pointed outward, toward vagrants or travelers who occasionally passed through the region. The isolation of the farm made it vulnerable to people who moved unseen across rural landscapes. But this explanation struggled against its own simplicity. A stranger might kill. A stranger might steal. But why stay in the house afterward? Why feed livestock? Why linger for days near the bodies of 6 victims? That kind of composure required something deeper than opportunity. It required familiarity with fear, or comfort with it. Investigators also explored the possibility of multiple perpetrators, more than one person working together under the cover of night. The brutality of the killings, the precision, the sheer physical strength needed to carry out the crime silently. All of it seemed possible for 2 men acting in coordination. But cooperation leaves traces. Shared secrets unravel. Shared responsibility produces different patterns. No such patterns ever emerged. The killer, or killers, remained invisible. Some villagers believed the crime was planned long before it happened. They pointed to the strange footsteps leading from the forest, to the noises heard in the attic, to the missing keys, to the unsettling feeling that someone had been studying the family from a distance. If the killer watched them long enough to memorize their routines, then the attack was not impulsive. It was methodical. It belonged to someone who understood exactly how each moment inside the house would unfold. But the most haunting theory was also the simplest, that the killer was someone the family trusted, someone whose presence would not have caused alarm, someone who could step onto the farm without raising suspicion. The idea unsettled investigators because it fit too well. It explained the lack of forced entry. It explained why the family stepped into the barn one by one. It explained the quietness of everything. Violence that arrives from a known face often arrives without warning. Yet this theory, like all the others, ran into a wall of uncertainty. Names were suggested. Broken relationships were examined. Alibis were recorded. But no proof appeared. Nothing tied any single person to the heart of the crime. The case remained suspended between possibilities. Each theory convincing. Each theory incomplete. Over time, the mystery grew larger than the investigation. People did not simply ask what happened. They asked why someone could do something so methodical and remain calm enough to stay afterward. Why the killer showed patience. Why they tended to chores. Why they acted as though the house belonged to them. It was this final question that kept investigators awake at night. A murder can be chaotic, but staying in the house turned chaos into ritual. It changed the crime from an eruption of violence into something colder, something practiced, something almost comfortable. By the time this segment ends, one truth becomes clear. Theories can help illuminate the shadows of Hinterkaifeck, but none of them can dissolve them. The crime continues to exist in a strange space between reality and imagination, between evidence and silence, between the world we know and the world that remains locked behind a door no one ever opened again. As the decades moved forward, the Hinterkaifeck case settled into a strange kind of permanence. It was no longer only a murder investigation. It became a landmark of uncertainty, a story people inherited rather than solved. Generations passed the mystery to one another the way families pass down heirlooms. Quietly, carefully, with an understanding that whoever held it next would find no final answer waiting inside. Why now? The original investigators were gone. Their notebooks had faded. The suspects had lived full lives, grown old, and died. But the theories remained. Some were kept alive by historians, others by locals who lived close enough to the land to still feel its silence. A few were preserved only in whispers, their origins impossible to trace back to any one person. Yet each theory carried a piece of the truth, or at least a piece of the fear that once lived on that lonely farm. One theory focused on the idea of a family grievance that had been allowed to deepen over years. Not revenge born from sudden anger, but resentment that stretched across time. This explanation drew people because it felt human, almost familiar. A conflict left unresolved, a relationship that fractured, a decision made in silence that eventually grew into something unrecognizable. Some believe the killer was someone who knew the victims well enough to wait patiently, to watch the farm from the forest line, to choose a moment when the family felt most vulnerable. But the theory remained only a shape, without names, without evidence that could be verified after so much time had passed. Another theory stayed rooted in the strange signs left behind. The footprints leading toward the farm with no return trail. The smoke rising from the chimney when the family was already gone. The animals tended as if by habit. Whoever stayed in that house behaved not like a stranger passing through, but like someone who felt entitled to that place, or someone who believed they had already been living in its shadows. Some investigators argued that the killer may have been dwelling near the property long before the murders, testing doors, learning routines, memorizing the pattern of lights at night. It was a theory that unsettled even the hardest skeptics, because it suggested the family had not been alone for far longer than they realized. There were also theories that expanded outward, reaching beyond the family's personal life into the wider tensions of rural Germany in the early 1920s. Political unrest, economic strain, movements of displaced people, stories of drifters passing through villages without leaving names behind. But these theories struggled to anchor themselves in the specific reality of the farm. They felt too broad for something so intimate, so focused, so deliberate. Across the years, newer investigators tried revisiting the case with modern tools. They examined old statements, redrew timelines, and compared testimonies that once seemed unrelated. But every time new clarity seemed close, it faded again. The evidence was too old, too compromised, too shaped by time and memory. The killer's presence lingered in the story, but not in the facts that could prove anything. What made the case endure was not simply the brutality of the event, but the way it blurred certainty. Every theory seemed possible. Every theory also seemed incomplete. The case sat at the edge of resolution without ever reaching it. And so listeners, readers, and researchers felt pulled into the same quiet struggle the original investigators faced, trying to make sense of a puzzle with pieces that no longer fit together. By the time nearly a century had passed, Hinterkaifeck no longer belonged only to the village where it happened. It had become one of Europe's enduring mysteries, shaped by the land, shaped by fear, shaped by the simple human desire to understand what happened in a place where silence became its own witness. No theory could close the story. None of them could open it fully, either. The truth remained tied to a farm that no longer exists and to a set of answers that never escaped the shadows of that long night. Chapter 10. The Echo That Never Fades. The years that followed the Hinterkaifeck murders did not bring peace to the quiet Bavarian farmland. Instead, the silence surrounding the old property deepened, becoming a kind of permanent shadow that stretched far beyond the collapsing barn and the rotting farmhouse walls. Even after the buildings were finally torn down, the land itself seemed to carry an unease, as if the soil remembered what human minds could not explain. People who passed by the empty field often said it felt colder there. Not frightening, just heavy, like a memory that refused to soften. Farmers avoided plowing too close to where the house once stood. Road workers spoke in low voices when assigned to the area. Even children who wandered into the nearby woods on summer afternoons somehow knew not to go too far toward the clearing where the Gruber and Gabriel families had once lived. It was as if the place had become a quiet monument to the unfinished. A reminder that violence without answers leaves its own kind of haunting. Investigators who had touched the case, men who had sifted through snow-soaked footprints, studied cracked lanterns, and stared too long at the locked attic door, carried the story with them long after retirement. Some admitted it only near the end of their lives. Some kept the memories sealed behind silence. Others confessed quietly to family members that Hinterkaifeck had changed the way they understood human nature. But all of them agreed on one thing. The case never truly felt closed. It felt paused, suspended in a moment that refused to resolve. Years became decades. New generations grew up hearing the story not as news, but as legend. A farm where footsteps were heard, but no stranger was found. A killer who might have lived in the attic. A family murdered in the cold, while animals lowed in the stalls and smoke drifted quietly from the chimney. And always, the same unsettling detail. Whoever committed the crime did not flee immediately. They stayed. They waited. They lived among the dead. That single fact gave the case a different weight, because it transformed the killer from a figure of rage into a figure of patience. Someone capable of moving through darkness without trembling. Someone comfortable with stillness. Someone who did not fear being discovered, because they understood something no one else did. Over the years, the theories grew so numerous that the truth seemed to recede further instead of becoming clearer. Some believed it was a family member. Some believed it was a drifter. Some believed it was someone from town who had smiled at the family during the day, then walked the lonely forest path back to the farm at night. But every theory had a missing piece. Every motive had a gap. Every timeline had a silence that could not be filled. The people of Weidhofen eventually stopped trying to solve the case. Instead, they learned to carry it. As part of the region's strange inheritance, a story passed down like an old photograph whose edges had frayed from being handled too many times. And still, even as time softened the sharpest edges of grief, one truth remained. Some stories do not fade. They echo. Hinterkaifeck was one of them. The investigators who revisited Hinterkaifeck decades later faced a landscape unchanged in its stillness, yet altered entirely by time. The farm was gone, demolished long ago, but the silence around it remained, an echo of everything that had happened and everything that was never understood. As they reviewed the case, they realized something unsettling. Every answer the early investigators believed they had secured depended on fragile assumptions, on memories blurred by grief, on testimonies shaped by fear, and on a community unprepared for the darkness that had unfolded in its center. The farm had been isolated not only by geography, but by the personalities of the Gruber family. Their secrecy, their conflicts, and their strained relationships created an atmosphere where truth became difficult to separate from rumor. Neighbors remembered details inconsistently. Some withheld small observations out of embarrassment or uncertainty. Others added layers over the years, convinced that memory could accomplish what evidence never had. The result was a story that grew, changed, and reshaped itself every decade. Modern analysis introduced new theories, but each one strained under the same weight that burdened investigators in 1922: the absence of living witnesses and the overwhelming presence of contradiction. Every person connected to the case carried a slightly different version of the truth. Some remembered seeing shadows near the tree line that night. Others recalled hearing footsteps on the path days before the murders. A few claimed they saw smoke rising from the chimney after the killings, confirming what investigators already suspected: that the killer had stayed in the house, comfortable enough to move through its rooms, feed the animals, and sleep under the same roof where 6 bodies lay. This detail remained one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. Whoever committed the murders did not flee in panic. They stayed. They lived inside the aftermath. They occupied the space as if nothing had happened. That level of composure suggested familiarity, either with the victims, the property, or both. It hinted at someone who did not fear discovery, someone who understood the family's routines, and someone who believed the farm's isolation would protect them long enough to erase their traces. But modern investigators were struck by an even more haunting realization. Familiarity alone could not explain the brutality. The blows were excessive, deliberate, and intimate. The bodies were arranged, covered, nearly tended to, as though the killer felt compelled to mask the violence they had committed. This mixture of savagery and strange tenderness pointed toward a psychological complexity the early investigators could not articulate at the time. The crime was not impulsive. It was not purely practical. It carried emotional weight: anger, frustration, obsession, or something deeper that had grown quietly until it reached an irreversible breaking point. As they reconstructed the final hours inside the barn, investigators noted the chilling sequence of events. One victim was attacked, then another drawn by noise, then another. Each person entered the dark space believing they were responding to a disturbance. Instead, they walked directly into the killer's reach. The method was patient, controlled, almost ritualistic. It required confidence. It required planning. And it suggested a single perpetrator with a singular, unwavering focus. Why, then, had the killer remained afterward? Modern theories ranged widely. Some believed the murderer needed time to compose themselves after an act they had long imagined but never enacted. Others proposed the stay was practical. The killer waited to avoid crossing paths with travelers on the lone road. Another theory suggested something far more chilling: that the killer stayed because they felt no urgency to leave, because being inside the Gruber home felt natural, familiar, or fulfilling in a way no one could understand from the outside. More than a century later, this question persists because it touches something essential about the case. The murders were horrifying, but the hours afterward were worse. They introduced a dimension of psychological darkness that defies simple explanation. The killer's presence inside the house blurred the line between violence and occupation, between destruction and possession. It transformed the crime from an act into an experience, one shared only by the murderer and the silent farm around them. And yet, even with the eerie details and decades of speculation, the most unsettling truth remains the same. The identity of the killer is no clearer today than it was in 1922. Every theory points towards someone plausible, but none arrives at certainty. The case endures not because of what is known, but because of what will never be recovered. Hinterkaifeck remains suspended in the space between evidence and myth, between memory and forgetting, between a brutal act and the endless quiet that followed it. As investigators stepped away from the Hinterkaifeck farm for the final time, something unusual lingered in the cold Bavarian air. It wasn't closure. It wasn't certainty. It was the quiet recognition that some stories refuse to end neatly, no matter how much evidence is collected or how many theories are shaped. The old farmhouse, empty and dismantled, no longer stood as a physical reminder of that night. But its absence created a different kind of imprint, one that lived in memory rather than structure. In the years that followed, people spoke of Hinterkaifeck with lowered voices, as if the land itself listened. Locals avoided walking near where the farm once stood, even after the buildings had been torn down. Travelers who passed through sensed something difficult to describe, a stillness heavy enough to feel intentional. It was the sort of silence that makes a person stop mid-step, unsure why the world suddenly feels tighter around them. Investigators who once believed the case might eventually find its answer slowly accepted a harder truth. Evidence fades. Memories distort. People who knew fragments of the story left this world carrying their secrets with them. And in that departure, the mystery deepened rather than softened. Every new generation searching through the facts faced the same strange puzzle. A crime so bold, so intimate, so quietly executed that it felt impossible for the killer to have remained invisible. And yet they did. As decades passed, Hinterkaifeck transformed from an investigation into a legend. Not the theatrical kind shaped by exaggeration, but the quiet kind built from gaps. Theories grew not because new information appeared, but because the old information refused to settle. Each expert, each historian, each curious visitor saw a different pattern in the same collection of fragments. The case became a mirror, reflecting more of the person studying it than the truth of the crime itself. In this way, the tragedy took on a new form. It became a story not only about loss, but about the unresolved nature of human understanding. Some mysteries linger because they are unsolvable. Others linger because they reveal things people are not ready to see. Hinterkaifeck seemed to exist somewhere between those extremes, too complex to forget, too incomplete to explain. Families of those lost carried the weight longest. Their grief moved through time without fading, but without direction. Without answers, mourning becomes something different. It becomes a quiet endurance, an attempt to live alongside a question rather than resolve it. Their silence, respectful and heavy, became part of the story's texture. The world debated theories, proposed motives, reconstructed timelines, yet those closest to the tragedy offered only dignified restraint. They kept the memory intact without feeding speculation. Meanwhile, the land returned to ordinary life. Seasons passed over the soil. Grass grew where the farmhouse once stood. Birds perched on posts that no longer held meaning. Nature is indifferent to mystery. It simply reclaims. But humans are different. They revisit. They retell. They carry questions forward. By the century mark, Hinterkaifeck no longer belonged solely to history. It belonged to every listener, every scholar, every quiet observer drawn to stories that resist resolution. It became a reminder that even the calmest countryside can hold shadows, and that silence can be as unsettling as any confession. And so, the story continued to breathe, not through answers, but through enduring curiosity. Each retelling kept the memory alive, not as a spectacle, but as a reflection of how deeply uncertainty can shape us. Hinterkaifeck remained a place where logic faltered, where suspicion fractured, and where the human desire for closure met its natural limit. The world moved forward, but the questions stayed exactly where they had always been. In the years after the murders, the farm at Hinterkaifeck stood as a hollow monument to fear. The house, once filled with the sound of chores, footsteps, and the rhythm of rural life, now sat untouched. Snow collected at its door. Grass grew in uneven patches where livestock once walked. Windows stared blankly toward the tree line. No family would ever live there again. No worker was willing to take over the land. Even the livestock that survived were removed as quickly as possible, as though the place itself carried a sickness that could spread. For decades, people avoided the path leading toward the property. Travelers walked in wider circles. Children were warned never to approach it. Some said the place was cursed. Others said the murderer had returned repeatedly to watch the empty house from the forest. Every theory fed the next. Every silence deepened the mystery. The farm remained, untouched by time, yet forever marked by one terrible night. Authorities eventually ordered the buildings torn down. It was not simply an act of practical decision, but an attempt to erase the memory of what happened inside those walls. When workers demolished the structure, they found nothing that solved the case. No hidden diary, no weapon tucked away, no sign of a struggle that police had missed. They left with dust on their clothes and the uneasy feeling that the real story of Hinterkaifeck would never be uncovered. Even after the demolition, the land kept its reputation. People still spoke about the strange footprints, the mysterious noises, the possibility that the killer lived in the house before the murders. They remembered how the dog barked into empty rooms. They remembered the unlocked doors found by neighbors days before the crime. The farm became a point where unanswered questions piled higher than the rubble that once covered the ground. Investigators revisited the case multiple times across the decades. Each new generation of detectives hoped that modern methods would uncover what earlier teams could not. New interviews were conducted with the descendants of neighbors. Old witness statements were re-examined, searching for inconsistencies. Rumors resurfaced, sometimes pointing toward a family feud, sometimes toward a traveling stranger, and sometimes toward someone the victims had known well. Yet every time the case felt close to resolution, the evidence thinned out again, like mist dissolving at dawn. Theories revolved around the same unsettling details. The footsteps in the snow leading toward the farm, but not away. The fresh food found on the table days after the murders. The evidence that someone fed the animals while the victims lay dead in the barn. The smoke seen rising from the chimney when no one was supposed to be alive inside. These details created a picture not of a rushed crime, but of someone comfortable within the walls, someone who took their time, someone who lingered. Some investigators believe the killer might have been living secretly on the property long before the murders. Perhaps in the attic, perhaps in the barn, perhaps in a hidden space no one ever found. The family, already unsettled by unexplained noises and the disappearance of household items, might have been unknowingly sharing their home with a stranger. Whether the intruder was waiting for a moment or escalating toward violence, no one could say. Others argued the opposite. They believed the killer was known to the family. Someone who visited them, someone who could approach without raising alarm, someone who understood the routine of the farm well enough to stay behind for days after the murders, tending to animals and lighting fires, as though trying to imitate normal life. Perhaps the killer wanted time to escape suspicion. Perhaps they wanted to erase the immediate clues before vanishing. The tragedy at Hinterkaifeck shaped the region's memory far beyond its rural borders. Newspapers reprinted the story for decades. Travelers visited the area to feel the atmosphere of a place marked by unanswered violence. Some brought flowers. Others carved initials into the soil. A few simply stood in silence, absorbing the weight of the land. What made the Hinterkaifeck murders endure was not just the brutality of the crime, but the eerie calm that followed. No frantic escape, no confession, no witnesses. Only a house slowly emptied of sound, a barn locked in stillness, and a series of unanswered clues that pointed in every direction and none at all. The descendants of the victims carried the story like a shadow. Some refused to speak about it. Others tried to preserve the memory so it would not be lost. They lived with the discomfort of knowing that their family's end had been turned into legend, whispered in fear and fascination by people who never knew the victims as real human beings. The land itself changed ownership over the years. Grass returned. Fields grew wild. But the story never left. It stayed within the soil, within the collective memory, within the lingering sense that something unnatural had passed through the farm and left a wound that time could not fully close. Today, the case remains one of Germany's most chilling unsolved mysteries. Modern investigators, historians, and true crime researchers still revisit it, hoping to uncover a sliver of truth hidden in the contradictions. But the silence remains deep, and the evidence remains fractured. In the end, Hinterkaifeck stands as a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how quickly a familiar place can turn ominous, how a home that feels protected can hide shadows no one sees until it is too late, and how some secrets, once created, do not fade. They settle into history and wait, unanswered, forever. And now, the voices of Hinterkaifeck fade back into the cold Bavarian night that a century has passed since that lonely farm fell silent. Yet the mystery remains untouched by time. A family erased. Footsteps in the snow with no origin. A killer who moved through the house as if he belonged there. Tending animals, eating meals, living among the dead. Some stories refuse to be solved. Some crimes refuse to grow old. And some shadows stay long after history insists they should disappear. Hinterkaifeck is all three. As you settle into rest tonight, let the unanswered questions drift quietly into the dark. Let the chilling details soften into distance. And allow the calm to return, the way it always does after a long journey through forgotten history. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening, reflecting, and exploring one of the world's most haunting unsolved mysteries. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. There's another calm true crime documentary waiting for you tomorrow night. For now, close your eyes, let the storm outside the farmhouse fade, and rest. This is True Crime Records. Good night.